Hey, good morning, everybody. Afternoon. See, you're not responding to morning. Hoping it will go away. Great. Well, I'd like to call to order the second meeting of the Redistricting Task Force for the City of Fort Worth. I'm Lorraine Miller, your chair, and I wanted to open our meeting today with just a couple of preliminary remarks. Let me see, we're joined by virtual, by whom?
Teresa Ayala is here.
Oh, hey. Hi, Teresa. Good to see you. Well, okay.
And, Mr. Shore is there.
Okay.
And then Elizabeth from San Antonio is joining us, and she'll have a presentation later.
Welcome.
And TJ Costello is also there, and he'll be your first presentation after your approval of the minutes.
Okay. And who are our task force members that are virtual?
Mr. Shore, Kent Bradshaw, and Ms. Ayala.
Great. So we have 3 in woo-woo land, and the rest of us are here. I call virtual woo-woo land. Okay. And here in the room, guys, why don't you just go around and just introduce yourself so we know who's here.
Graham Norris.
Sal Espino.
Linda Kennedy. Tracy Scott.
Tony DeVito.
Craig Allen.
Great. We're all here together. Colleagues, I wanted to start our meeting off today with a mild discussion, but something I've been thinking about as we try to figure out how we're going to go about doing criteria and procedures. I understand that there is a great number of advocates for an independent redistricting committee. And that is something that should be considered or not, but it is, while that is a great issue for us, for someone to pursue, that is not the charge of our redistricting task force. Developing the criteria and the procedures for redistricting is this council's charge. That does not mean that advocates for an independent redistricting committee or someone of a different view should not make their views known to this task force. We welcome that. Part of what I hope we do as a task force is make it welcoming for residents to come and to the task force and say, this is what I like to see us do, this is not what I'd like to see us do, and we take all of that in, welcoming that. These folks are very much welcome, and I believe one of the goals that's reflected in the 2018 Task Force on Race and Culture Governance Strategy #1. It laid out a redistricting criteria and procedures, and that goal #1 was that redistricting, that the goal was to create districts, when drawn, provide the best opportunity to elect city council members who reflect the diversity of population of the city. Now that's what our Race and Task Force Commission suggested in 2018, and I hope through the criteria and procedures that we are going to work on, that is an overriding goal, that we create districts, when drawn, provide the best opportunities to elect city council members who reflect the diversity of population of Fort Worth. I think that is our overarching goal here. And I think it's important that this task force spend some time constructively on what we can do. And I have asked the mayor and Mr. Fernando Costa to consider one of the things that I'd like to really see us delve into, which is education. I think we have to make a concerted effort as a task force to educate the public on what redistricting entails. I had someone to tell me the other day they had no idea what was involved in redistricting, and especially since we're adding 2 council districts. So I asked them to consider that our city staff would develop a redistricting 101 course, similar to the briefing we received at our September meeting, that we engage the neighborhood associations and community-based organizations to be able to come either in person or virtually to receive this briefing, and to be able to ask questions, maybe look at the model mapping that we've got done. I think we should open this up to the public for transparency and accountability. That because our task force is made up of the second part of this, that's the education piece. Let's educate our neighborhood associations and our community-based organizations. That way, I think we will improve the turnout when we have our forums, our hearings. I've served on a couple of task force, and you go to the task force where they have the hearings, like I did one for a park in my neighborhood. And they had all these publications went out. You know how many people showed up at the hearing? 4, and I was 1. And so we want to do better than that. This is much too important to the residents of our city for 4 people to show up. So we've got to make a concerted effort to make sure people know that it's happening and that we welcome their point of views. Because our task, the second part of what I'm proposing we do is because we are made up of varied talents and we represent a cross-section of Fort Worth, I've asked that we do guest articles by task force members, each of you, to be placed in the Star Telegram, in the Fort Worth Weekly, in the Fort Worth Business Press, and other local neighborhood papers, so that our residents know what's going on with the task force and what we're trying to do. If you go back to the presentation, we received, what was this? The presentation of Redistricting Task Force on Citizen Participation. This was distributed at our September 17 meeting. One of the things that struck me when I got home and started reading this again, if you go back and look, it cited several things that lessons learned, how to improve citizen participation. It talked about citizens' plans receive more weight than other plans, that citizen improvement ended with submitted plans, that we needed to ensure more inclusive representation of neighborhoods and communities of interest. It said that we should broaden participation, not limit to residents who submit completed plans, give some weight to the residents of the district, avoid district plans drawn by non-residents. I think these are just a few of the things on how to improve citizen participation and lessons learned that we ought to take to heart as a task force and try to do better. So the education proposal that I've offered I think is a decent first step. I hope that it should be critically reviewed by this task force. And I think it's a good concrete step forward to help us get to the criteria and the procedures that will ensure the residents of involvement and transparency in the process. And so with that, Mr. Costa, I'd like to just take a few minutes, if we could, if you wanted to have a comment, but I'd like for the task force members, if you got a comment, this is all open for our discussion, so if we could take just a couple of minutes to hear from the task force members of what you think. Be shy, this is not a shy group.
Yes, so I'd like to definitely take a moment and say that I support the education portion. Oh, sorry. Education and the public briefing. A lot of times, well, redistricting is a great example of a big process that is not understood in common life. And educating the public on what the process is, I think gets buy-in. And you are, you get more support from the community, larger voter turnout, and then help with figuring out just what the community would like. So I agree with and I support wholeheartedly the education and public briefing. And the guest articles is a great idea.
Great. Mr. DeVito, I see it in your eyes.
I was just going to say I agree with your comments. I've already discussed this process with my board of directors on my homeowners association. They were excited to hear about it and very anxious to participate. And additionally, I plan to meet with the North Fort Worth Alliance of Neighborhoods, which is a group that represents some 30-odd associations in far north Fort Worth, to try to get input from as many of those as are willing and able to provide it. So I agree with your comments completely.
Yes, obviously the education piece is great. The more the public knows about the redistricting process, especially since we're complying with the will of the voters in 2016 when they voted in a charter amendment election to go from 8 single-member districts to 10. I do have a question for legal and for staff. Even though the charge to this committee may not get us to the Independent Redistricting Commission, if we find that that is a good government best practice, can a task force member or the task force say, council, take another look at it? And that's my question to legal or to staff.
Could certainly include that in your recommendations to council. That would be fine.
Okay, thank you so much, because as we've seen already, that's been a keen interest of many of these advocacy groups. And I'm interested today in hearing from Austin on how their experience was, because city council elections are nonpartisan, and I think that's a good thing. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Austin about how their Independent Redistricting Commission worked. But look forward also, I volunteer, like everyone here on this task force, for guest articles. And I would also say that we make them available in Spanish as well, because we have a sizable community that we also want to reach in Spanish. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brother Sal. Great. Committee members, I'm assuming that everyone had a chance to peruse the minutes that Ms. Kaiser's sent to us. Are there any corrections that you see that needed? If not, could I have a motion? I'd like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the September 17 meeting.
So moved. This is Teresa.
Ms. Teresa, Ms. Ayala, and Mr. Espino. All in favor, would you vote by the usual sign of aye? Any abstentions? Any noes? Abstentions? Great, thank you. That's why I like you guys. You're easy to move. Okay, now we'll move into our briefings about the redistricting criteria and procedures in comparable cities. This is probably the meat of what we want to get done. This one and, well, everything we're doing today is pretty meaty. The The briefings from on criteria and procedures, our briefing on the Voting Rights Act, and our briefing on local demographic trends in redistricting are going to be very important to us. So if we could dive right into it, we have Mr. from Austin, TJ Costello. Mr. Costello is the Vice Chair of the Austin Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. Mr. Costello, you got it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. As mentioned, my name is TJ Costello. I am currently the Vice Chair of the Austin Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. For the next 3 months, I am the Vice Chair. Your opening statement was quite clear, and I understand what your group is charged with. But in Austin in 2012, the citizens chose and they voted for a new charter, a charter amendment that started the independent redistricting commission for a new city council with districts. All the council members were chosen at large up until 2014, and starting in 2014, they were chosen by district. Our group was the first of its kind, from what I was told in the nation, and it was very interesting at points. But basically, our charge was a lot of things you mentioned in your opening statement, to try to select opportunities to select members, reflect the diversity of the city, incorporate communities of interest to the best of our ability, educate the citizenry, and get them involved as much as possible. We have 14 members on our commission by charter. Everything about our commission is in the charter, and I have asked Ms. Kaiser to give you a copy of the charter and our final report so you can have it for reference. But in the charter, it clearly states there's 14 members. Anyone with meeting certain criteria could apply to be on the commission. We had 500 people in our group apply, of which 350 or so met all the criteria. An auditing group, which was also independently selected, chose the best 60 of that 350 or so. And those 60 were literally thrown into one of those bingo rollers, and the first 8 names were literally pulled out of a hat. And those 8 members were initially charged with selecting the next 6 to try and have representation of the city as best possible. Certain areas of the town had to be represented, certain criteria. The charter states must match the citizenry, the demographics of the city, which in Austin's case meant we had to have at least one member who was African American. And then the charter actually says there must be one student member of the 14. So we had one member who was actually a student at the University of Texas. So we got together, and I can go through all the trials and tribulations at another time, or if you so wish. But at the end of the day, we had 50 meetings over 4 months. We were on a very, very tight deadline, being the initial commission. And on December 1st, we submitted a map to City Council for approval that was immediately accepted by the residents of the city. 72 folks ran for 11 positions, and there were no lawsuits, which is one of the things we were really worried about. But there were no lawsuits challenging the map at all. And so it was a very successful endeavor. I think it went, being the initial group, there were some hiccups, but I think it went very smoothly. The one thing that we found, and I'm going to, again, referring to your opening statement, not only is it education and involvement of the citizenry, but it's also education of the commission as well. We struggled early on with misinformation from public testimony as to what the role of the commission was and what we were allowed to do and not allowed to do. And I think it's very important that whatever form your redistricting commission takes, that the education of the commission takes place. And the one thing is that you mentioned independent commission may or may not be in the cards this time around, but independence has two forms. Sure, we were independent to draw lines without interference from city council, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also independence of information without bias. Having your own attorney, having advisors who are on your staff, on the commission staff, really paid off because it was unbiased information that was provided just for us and had no overtones or undertones from anywhere else. I have the map. Our map is on the screen, I see. And this is the map that we submitted to the city. As you can see, there are 10 districts. Every single line for every single district has a reason behind it. There's not a single line we cannot defend. We try to get as many communities of interest together. But to your opening statement, we had some issues where folks would come in with, for lack of a better term, code words, stating that their community of interest was not in line with other community of interests and so on and so forth. And other people who were adamant and not educated as to what a council district should be. And we have folks coming in and saying, our area is a community of interest and it's great, and we want our own council district. And there were only 40,000 residents. And so the question to them would be, okay, what other 40,000 people should be in your district? And they didn't have an answer. So again, going with your education of the citizenry. But getting them involved is huge. The best anecdote I have from for our group is you can see in District 5, which is kind of a aqua color, at the very northern tip, if anyone's been to Austin along Lady Bird Lake with a river, there's an area we call Restaurant Row, and they had a lot of development and a lot of apartment buildings being built. And we thought it was very, very similar to the downtown area, which, if you're familiar, has had a lot of development of late. So we voted for this area of, I think it was 500 or 1,000 folks from the census to be in the downtown District 9. And the next meeting, a citizen came in and made a fantastic presentation as to why that area really belongs in District 5. And if it wasn't for District 5 or the folks in that area, that Restaurant Row area would not be where it is today. And it was because of that presentation that we put that area called Restaurant Row back into District 5. So good presentations and good education is a good thing. And the other anecdote I have is, again, getting education out early on. We had some folks who were in the know, and they came and then said, we represent a certain area of the city. And lo and behold, 2, 3, 4 weeks later, we get other folks come up who truly represented the area of the city, and their opinions were quite different than the initial group that came in. So yes, getting education is huge. Education of the commission as much as education of the citizenry. And I'm open for any questions you might have as to our process and the trials and tribulations we went through.
Mr. Costello, thank you. It's interesting. If I could, let me start off the question. I'm intrigued. How did you come to a map that people agreed to? What, can you just delve into that a little bit and give us a little detail?
So the big one was, there were a couple areas on that. One is there was, because we had so many meetings and everyone in the commission were from different areas, and we're all chosen based on our merits, not by people we know, if you will. So everyone was chosen, or everyone had background in where there were professors and they were organizers and there was professionals and retirees and so on and so forth. Everyone came from a different perspective and different demographic group. Families, non-families, older, younger, male, female, et cetera, et cetera. So we developed a respect for each other and a respect for where everyone was coming from. And that was important. And in the end, when we started doing the maps, we took all the public testimony. As I said, we had 50 public meetings over the course of till the final report was submitted. We took everything into account, and based on the respect we had for each other, we were able to have mini groups kind of focus on different parts of the town, different parts of the city. And really the core of each district, there was really no issue regarding the core. So if you take District 7, for instance, it's based around the area we call the Domain, which is a very new, big development in Austin. District 9 was based around downtown, and you can go through each one. So when we got to the edges, that we had to take into account all the rules and regulations, Constitution, communities of interest. They had to be contiguous, so on and so forth. And every member had to make a case for every section of town along the edges. And so, for instance, I was charged by the chair to oversee the northern part of Austin. And I was able to make a case for every district, but every member could challenge it. So there's an area along the edge of District 7 and District 4, and it's a 2-block area. And originally, District 7 was proposed to be a little further south on the northern section. And the couple of members of the commission advocated that this 2-block section really belonged in District 4. It was a community of interest, et cetera, et cetera. And so we were able to give and take and come up with these lines accordingly. And in the end of the day, it was a unanimous vote, and we can back up every single line.
Great, thank you. Committee members, Mr. Espino?
If I understand Austin, when set up the independent redistricting committee or commission, the voters had approved going from, I guess in the past, Austin had elected their council members at large, and this was a plan that went to 10 single-member districts. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right, and then, so here in Fort Worth, we're going from 8 single-member districts to 10. So a couple of questions. I look at your council districts, they look very compact. Did you at all, since you were going to 10 as opposed to 6 at large, did you guys not even worry about the incumbent constituent relation factor? In other words, in some redistricting, obviously incumbents try to protect their boundaries. In your process, since it was citizen-based, was that criteria not weighed in, number one? And then two, I'm curious, for the reason for going to single-member district was to have more diversity. One of the factors, I guess, was to have more compact districts, more diversity, both in terms of race, ethnicity, and also geographic diversity. Were those goals accomplished as a result of this process?
Very much so. So one of the problems with Austin in the past is that, as you say, we had at-large council members, but they were all living in the same area. So it really wasn't one in the charter. It says we should not take that into consideration, but also there really was no way to take it into consideration because they all lived in the same area. Which is one of the reasons why the voters voted for the 10-1 plan. In terms of diversity, we were, as I mentioned, we were charged by the Voting Rights Act and the other legal issues which are listed in our final report. And one of the things we wanted to do, or we had to do, was we had to have an opportunity district. In Austin, our African-American population is primarily in the District 1 area, and we had to have an opportunity district for the African-American population. And based on demographics, we had to have at least 3 opportunity districts for our Hispanic population. And District 1 ended up being our African American Opportunity District. Districts 2, 3, and 4 are Hispanic Opportunity District. But interestingly, District 5, there was some talk back and forth on, do we water down Districts 2 and 3 and make 5 an Opportunity District as well? And at the end of the day, we decided, no, let's leave it as is, and 5 someday, and maybe this is the census, there could be 4 Hispanic Opportunity Districts rather than 3.
Thank you.
I'd want to make sure we had Ms. Ayala and Mr. Scher are on virtually. You have any questions?
I do, yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Costello. This has been very helpful. I know that Mr. Spino asked about diversity, which I think is very important. And then, just getting to this map, I congratulate you on that. Can you talk a little bit more about how demographics played into your group as a whole, and how you relied on demographics to kind of help you with this whole exercise, please? Because you've alluded to it a few times, but if you could talk a little bit more, elaborate about that, would be helpful.
Sure. So first and foremost, and on the map on the screen, if you could scroll down to the bottom, if you don't mind, I think it's, you'll see that this is the population. So our target was 79,000 and change for each district, and we had a plus or minus, I believe it was 5%. We could go plus or minus 5%. And you can see we're pretty close. There was one district, I think it's District 8, that is a little on the low side. It's 3% below, and one of the reasons we felt to keep it on the low side is because Austin was scheduled to annex a very large population within 2 years. So we did not want to face the chance that we had an overpopulation in that area, which means we could possibly maybe have to readdress the district lines. But you can see that everything was within that 5% of 79,000. Then we had, we looked at, in terms of populations, we looked at all the populations. We had an Asian member on our commission who asked us to look at Asian population, but it's very spread out in the city of Austin. As I mentioned, our African American population just happens to be very concentrated in the northeast section of the city, and our Hispanic population tends to be concentrated in the north central and in the south and east section of the city. So from that perspective, we didn't have to worry about our lines being too crazy to incorporate folks, communities of interest into opportunity districts. But on the other hand, we had to be very conscious of cracking and packing. And in fact, at one point, and it's in public testimony, we had what we called the most perfect opportunity district. We incorporated 2 old Hispanic neighborhoods, and everyone was just ecstatic about our map. Until the next week, when we were informed by our attorney that we had to readdress it because we were too close to the packing threshold, and there was a lot of sad faces, but we ended up coming up with the lines we have now. So we have to be very conscious of the packing and cracking aspects of it as well. But in Austin, just the way it's laid out, some of our tasks was made easy. But on the other hand, we had to be very conscious of the cracking, packing, but also you had communities of interest. And as I said, different folks came in. This area is historically with that area. We had the rail lines and roads, and making sure things could be contiguous, and just like you'll face in Fort Worth.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Costello. Any other questions from committee members?
Just real quickly, when you talk about opportunity district, what exactly, how did y'all define that term? What exactly did that mean?
Sure. It means that you have the opportunity to elect someone who reflects your interests or your, in this case, your ethnic or racial background, where you have the opportunity to run for office in that district and be elected by folks who understand your positions and things of that nature. And I think the chair's opening comment, opportunity to select members that reflect the diversity of the city. That's how we defined it, and that's how we approached it.
Mr. Costello, what about partisan politics? How did you stave that off? Or did you?
Oh, well, the lobbyists came out in force. There were some folks who pushed for certain areas, but again, having a independent commission from various backgrounds, folks could speak could speak to any issue that was brought up. So I'll give you an example. One of the areas, our District 1 area, it was the African American Opportunity District, and it's in our final report. It included downtown area and a portion of UT, University of Texas, with minimal population, but symbolically it was important for it to be in District 1. And the Downtown Alliance all wanted their area in the same district, and they asked about it, and we came up with our reasoning. Also, I-35 has historically been a barrier, and we consciously looked to cross that barrier, and 7 of our 10 districts cross I-35.
Great, thank
But
you.
in terms of partisan politics, yes, we did have lobbying and such. Folks wanted, we have folks who wanted to run for office who came to a lot of meetings trying to hand draw their district.
Okay. Any other questions, task force members?
Yes, this is Kent Bradshaw. I had one quick question. So thank you, Mr. Costello. My question was, currently the districts in Fort Worth, each of them, they kind of try to divide up downtown, given that it's the kind of the commercial, center of the city. And, I don't know whether that's something that should continue or not, because it doesn't seem like it follows, I would say the community aspect of it. Did you guys have any deliberations about, looking at any part of Austin as, something that everybody should share in, or did you say, we're going to look at the communities as communities and not really look at power structures per se that needed to be equally shared amongst the district?
Sure. So it wasn't a question of there was some thought put into very briefly about having a pie type districts where everything comes out of a certain core. But again, part of the reasons that we existed was because that all of City Council came for the most part came from one area of town, and that wanted to be. The members wanted to avoid that at all costs. The other is when we looked at community of interest, and Austin has some unique aspects to it. We looked at some of the hubs, and for instance, Williamson County had about 60,000 folks in the city of Austin. It was decided early on that folks in Williamson County should all be in one district because they have a community of interest. There's certain rules and laws and such that they face that the rest of Austin doesn't face. And we had University of Texas downtown, and that was a large population that we felt was important to keep together. And then we had, as I said, we had our opportunity districts. The African American population is very much in East Austin for large concentrations in East Austin, and so on and so forth. And when you started looking at those hubs, if you will, we built around those hubs, and this is the best map that we had to meet those criteria that we kind of set out for ourselves.
Great.
Thank you.
Ms.
Thank you.
Miller, I do
Yes.
believe Mr. Schur has a question, and he's having a hard time.
I was about to say, Mr. Schur. Mr. Schur, are you on? And then we will go to Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Schur? Well, while he's trying to get on, Ms. Kennedy, you mind going ahead and asking your question?
Yes. When we go back to how you dealt with politics and people with political agendas, did you have any of that on your actual committee? Did you have people on your committee who were perhaps interested in running for a council seat themselves?
No, the charter makes it clear that we are not allowed, we cannot have worked for the city, received any money from the city for, I think it's 3 years prior to being on the commission. And we cannot be on any other commission for a period of time, and we cannot run for office while we are active members of the commission.
Okay.
So there was people came in with knowledge of certain aspects of the city that maybe others didn't have, but no one came in. I don't believe, or I never felt that anyone came in with an agenda of any kind.
Thank you. Mr. Schur?
And can I follow up to Ms. Kennedy's question?
Sure.
So this goes to the whole picking names out of a barrel situation we have here. Is if people were going in with an agenda, the odds that they're going to be chosen were basically, whatever the bingo balls rolled, that was the odds of you getting chosen. So if you were going in with an agenda, if an agenda was laid out for folks to go in, the odds of getting on were very slim. And I think people, at least in our commission, were very excited to be part of this process and wanted to, like I said, there were no lawsuits and and 72 folks ran for 11 positions, and the map was accepted immediately. And I think that's what every member of the commission focused on. I know that's what I focused on. I was very excited when we had those three accomplishments met. And then going forward, just to give you an idea, going forward, our next commission that's coming up in January, chosen in bingo balls, will be rolled out in January. The goal is to have one member from each district, but I believe up to 50 people applied from each district. I think it goes down from 20 folks from certain districts to up to 50. And so it's very spread out population, and folks are going on for different reasons. And the likelihood of having an agenda pass with 14 members spread out throughout the city is very, very small.
Right. Ms. Kaiser, is Mr. Schur ready?
I think he's dropped and is going to try to rejoin. So,
okay.
Oh, he's back on. Sir, Mr. Schur, can you hear us? If you'll unmute, and you should be able to address the task force.
Madam Chair, if you'd like, I could stay active for a while if anyone has any follow-up questions.
Sure, we appreciate that. So let's move to Ms. To San Antonio. Elizabeth M. Ms. Provencio, pronounce your last name so I don't.
It's Provencio.
Provencio. Got you.
Yes, ma'am.
Elizabeth M. Provencio is the first assistant city attorney, the city of San Antonio. Welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all.
Great.
I do have a presentation and that will walk us through San Antonio's process in its last redistricting.
Colleagues, you should have it at your desk in your materials.
Thank you for that, Mary. I appreciate you pulling it up. And so different from what you just heard from the city of Austin, the city of San Antonio has had single member districts since the late 70s. So our last redistricting has occurred in a different manner because we've had single member districts for quite some time now. And so I'll walk you through what that timeline was, some reflections on some of the considerations and the criteria, and ultimately the adoption of the plan. So next slide, please. The goal was to start the process before the expected release date of the census data in March of 2011, and ultimately to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department with sufficient time to be able to hold our 2013 elections. Next slide, please. So those two served as our bookends for our timeline. And the city team that was put together in order to support the efforts throughout redistricting consisted of personnel from the city manager's office. We had city attorney support in that. Our planning and development services department provided personnel to support the effort, office of the city clerk, and we also hired an outside legal consultant to work through with us to be able to navigate the all the interests at hand. And that was a Bickerstaff attorney by the name of David Mendez, who is an expert in this field. Next slide, please. So our timeline reflected that in the early January, February timeframe, we went out for an RFQ to be able to solicit an expert on redistricting. As I mentioned before, the outcome of that was us retaining Mr. Mendez, and then there was the release of the data. And in that April-May timeframe, we started estimating and taking a look at what our current districts look like compared to the data that we received. Next slide, please. And we also had city council elections. So of course, those were conducted with the then existing single member districts, and those elections occurred subsequent to those new council members and the incumbent council members being seated. Then we proceeded with a briefing to get the new council members updated on what the timeline was, what needed to occur, and what that process would look like. At that point, council then appointed a council redistricting committee to be able to work on this, which was supported by the city staff that I mentioned earlier. And to the point of, well, what did our data show for purposes of our districts? We had an imbalance or a deviation, as they refer to it, of 39%. And meaning that our ideal size population for each district based on the new census data was that each district have approximately 132,000 residents in that district. And so the 39% imbalance was a result of some of our mostly south side areas of San Antonio, those districts being less than 19% of that 132. So we did not have enough folks in those districts. And then on the north side of our city, we saw imbalance in that there was greater than 19%, almost 20% above the 132,000. So in adding those two percentages, where we were under and where we were over, we had an imbalance of 39%, which indicated there would be work on each of those council districts. Next slide, please. So there was continued discussion with council members for them to help us identify communities of interest and potential alternative scenarios that could be implemented. And ultimately, in September of that year, City Council adopted guidelines and criteria for us to follow as we proceeded. And that criteria you'll see reflected ultimately in the plan that was adopted, but I'll cover those here. At that time, it was 5 primary criteria of adopting districts of relatively equal size, identifiable boundaries, maintaining communities of interest and neighborhoods was the 3rd. The 4th was using whole voting precincts. And the 5th was basing the plan on existing districts. And so our charter language that governs how we are required to proceed requires that the council districts be as nearly equal in population as practicable, and that we also must consider certain factors which include annexation, population shifts, compactness, ethnic groups, and other criteria established by law. So once we had an illustrative plan based on the criteria that was designated, and in working with our outside counsel to be able to put together effectively a draft, or what was referred to as the illustrative plan, then that gave the opportunity for community meetings to be held to be able to get input from the public. Next slide, please. And as a result of the meetings that were held, the illustrative plan was revised. And throughout each iteration, and to provide as much information to the public as possible, as well as facilitate transparency, the city maintained all that redistricting information and the status on its website so that it was easily accessible to anybody that wanted to study it, learn about it, participate in it. The city did not receive any alternative plans, and ultimately the revised draft plan, or the revised illustrative plan, was presented for adoption by our city council. And when it was adopted, it met all of the following criteria. Next slide, please. So it satisfied our 1 person, 1 vote requirement. The overall deviation was 9.80, so considerably better than the 39 that we had originally started with. It was based upon the 2010 census data. It used readily identifiable boundaries. It maintained communities of interest and neighborhoods to the extent possible, used whole voting precincts to the extent practicable. Next slide, please. It was based on existing districts. Districts were compact and contiguous. The incumbents were in their districts. It minimized retrogression of majority-minority districts and was narrowly tailored to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And the last slide, please. So at that point, the city submitted its plan to the Department of Justice for pre-clearance. It was approved, and the plan became effective for the following May 2013 city council elections. And so that was our road to redistricting as a result of the 2010 census in San Antonio.
Great, thank you, thank you. Very comprehensive. Colleagues, any questions? Ms. Kennedy, go ahead.
I have a couple. You didn't list in here your redistricting guidelines that you guys used. Is there a way we can get a copy of those? And also, you guys redistrict, but you kept the same number of districts, and is that correct? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Espino?
I may have missed it, but the council redistricting committee, was that, those were council members that the mayor appointed to serve in that capacity, right? And they're the ones that guided the design of the illustrative plan? Or how did that work?
I'll have to get with you. I wasn't with the city at that point in time. I'm not sure if those were citizen members or council members, but I can confirm and get that to Mr. Costa. Right, and then it looks like the council did keep the criteria of incumbency, the incumbents reside in their districts, because the map, now San Antonio is very diverse. I looked at your 10 city council members and the mayor at large. It's a very diverse. You have a great breakdown of women, men, geographical diversity, and so it's a very diverse city council. So I commend San Antonio. And there were no lawsuits filed, right? Once you got the pre-clearance from the Department of Justice, that was it. And now we're not under pre-clearance anymore, but there were no lawsuits filed with respect to that plan, right? That is correct, sir.
Mr. Provencio, I think for you and Mr. Costello, I'm trying to, in my brain, trying to figure out, one of the things that both of you did, you had some pre-plan. So you had an illustrative plan, and then Austin had a plan that was presented that received approval, correct? Ms. Provencio, CEO? Yeah. Okay. Mr. Costello, is that?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Well, could you repeat the question, please?
Well, I'm making an observation, really, is that both of you had a kind of predetermined plan that was submitted, either the electorate voted for it, or a plan that was submitted to the council and they adopted it.
You mean a plan for the process or a plan for our final product?
I'm thinking plan for final project. You tell me. Go ahead.
Obviously, our process was voted on by the city, by members of the folks who voted that year. Voted overwhelmingly for the 10-1 plan. So the plan was laid out in the charter, and you have a copy of the charter. I mean, it goes into the detail of what you can and can't do and how you are chosen and such is very minute. It gets really into the weeds. But in terms of what we submitted, the charter made it clear that if we did not have a plan by a certain day, it went to city council, and when the race would be on, who could come up with one first. So we had a specific day we had to be finished by, which was December 1st of that year. And we presented our final report and our map to the city prior to that date. And the city accepted it. I don't think they had a choice, but they accepted it. They could have fought it. And that's how we got to our final, how everything ended up going the way it was.
Great.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Mr. Schur, I see that you've joined us, and I want to give you an opportunity to jump in. You're on mute, sir.
No.
Unmute yourself.
No, he just.
Let me see if I can. Yeah, he seems to be having some technical difficulties, and we've asked him to put his questions into the chat, and then we'll relay them.
Mr. Schuer, put your questions in the chat and we'll address them. I know it's frustrating because we want to hear from you. Okay. Committee members, any other questions of either of our panelists who've been just outstanding?
Just an observation, Madam
Yes,
Chair.
sir.
In Austin, the Redistricting Commission, they went through this elaborate process to design the plan with public input, had all these meetings all over the city. In San Antonio, they came out with I guess there was a redistricting committee, which we're going to find if it was either citizen committee or council committee. They came up with an illustrative plan that then went out for input. And then I guess to Austin, once the council accepted that map, that was after all this process where there were all these public meetings and members of the redistricting commission came up with a map. So the map that the redistricting task force commission did in Austin was a result of intense public comment and public process, which was open and really a very detailed process. So again, commend them for that effort.
Absolutely. It's one of the reasons that I think obviously a lot of education in Austin and San Antonio went on with the residents, so they knew what was going on, which I think whetted their appetite to participate. So gave them cause. Mr. Schuer, are you available now?
Listen today.
Okay. All right. Any other questions?
Mr. Schuer's question is up on the chat, if I can answer it.
What's the question?
Madam Chair?
Yes, he's asking in Austin and San Antonio, who actually drew up the maps and made the adjustments?
In Austin, the commission actually drew the maps. We hired a consultant. The charter allowed us to have our own staff, and we had our own attorney. We had an administrator who only answered to the chair, and we hired a mapping consultant. And the mapping consultant assisted us, but we drew all the lines. Every single line that was drawn was us. Every single adjustment that was made was us. And that is why I said we can support and defend every single line in that map.
Great. Did Mr. Schuer have another question in the chat?
I think he had the similar question with regard to San Antonio. And while I was not a participant, Mr. Schuer, I was with the city at that time. My understanding is that in consultation with our outside counsel is how our map was drawn.
Any other questions from our colleagues? Anybody? Ms. Ayala? Okay. Well, thank you to both of you, Mr. Costello and Ms. Provencio. You guys were just absolutely stupendous. And I see Mr. Espino has given the thumbs up from all of us. We appreciate not only your presentations today, but we were able to learn so much from what you have already done. Lessons learned, and we're trying to emulate a lot of what you've done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Okay, that was fun. Let's move on to our next section. We're going to have a briefing on the Voting Rights Act from our Deputy City Attorney, Ms. Guzman. There she is.
Good afternoon. What I'm actually going to cover is the answer to a couple of questions that you all had at the last meeting. The couple of questions that were presented was number one, what is bail-in exactly relative to the preclearance requirements of the Voting Rights Act? And the second one was what is a community of interest? Because that's one of the allowable criteria, and we just heard that term multiple times in the last two presentations. So, do you want me to do the operator? I got it. Okay. So the next slide. So bail-in, let's first kind of talk about what that is. Bail-in means that a federal judge, if they find discrimination has occurred through any part of the election or voting process, if they found that discrimination, then that jurisdiction, a particular jurisdiction, can be required to be subject to preclearance by the Department of Justice. That's always been a part of the Voting Rights Act. It's become a little bit more important here recently, and I'll go over why. So the Voting Rights Act has, or had, a section 4B, which said that a jurisdiction was subject to preclearance by the Department of Justice if it met a set of criteria. Those criteria were set in the years that you see there, 64, 68, and 72. Now, this was intended to only last for about 5 years, but the jurisdictions that met the criteria in 1972, the entire state of Texas and all of its jurisdictions combined being one of those, they kept moving it forward. So even though it was supposed to only last for 5 years, they kept extending it. So in fact, the last census, 2010, the entire state of Texas was still subject to preclearance because it had met the requirements in 1972 to be subject to preclearance. So in 2013, there was a Supreme Court case that struck it down. And it said that you are not allowed to use these criteria that are old anymore. They need to be updated. Well, that hasn't happened. So that has made this bail-in provision that much more important. And if you could advance, Mary. Thank you. So Section 3, the bail-in provision, if there is found to be unconstitutional discrimination, a judge can still require that. Like I said earlier, it's always been an option to take care of pockets of discrimination that weren't covered by those big jurisdictions that were included in that 1972 set of data. But to kind of show you how often it was used, it really wasn't. So from 1965 up through that Supreme Court case in 2013, only 18 jurisdictions, and that could be of any level of government, what were bailed in, as opposed to 1,084 jurisdictions under the other process. Since 2013, only 2 districts in the entire United States have been bailed in, one in a city in Alabama and one a city in Texas, Pasadena. It was bailed in because of discriminatory effect on Latinos in the city when they did their redistricting program. The state of Texas as a whole has not yet been bailed in. There's been 2 opportunities where the federal courts could have done so, and they both declined, and I have those 2 cases listed there. That is bail-in. The second question was about communities of interest. We heard a lot of reference to that just now. It's very hard to define communities of interest. The courts have not come up with a single definition of it. In fact, I put this on here because it made me chuckle when I read it. It was out of a white paper that I read. It says the term suffers from a great deal of ambiguity, the lack of an objective measurement strategy, and the absence of a methodology. So there is no uniform definition for this. There's little guidance from the Supreme Court. Some states actually define it in their state law. Texas is not one of them. But most states that do define it use either geography or some other kind of commonalities. And the commonalities that I had mentioned last time were social, cultural, and economic. If you could advance. I threw a few states' definitions up there so you could see that I'm not kidding when I say it's all over the map on how they define it. Alabama's is pretty long. Arizona just happens to mention it in passing. Hawaii really zeroes in as socioeconomic status. So there's a variety of ways that it can be defined. But the advice that we will give the map makers is to not make race the only factor in a community of interest because of all the reasons that I went over in my last presentation, that would be prohibitive. So I also wanted to touch on 2 other things just as they have come up tonight. The Opportunity District, you had asked about that. That is very data-driven. So his definition was good about the purpose, but in terms of how you make it and why you are able to make it, that all comes down to figuring out how much the voting of the different races are polarized. So in other words, there could be conceivably an area that has both minority and majority group in it, but they would vote together as a block, so that's okay. That was okay. It wouldn't necessarily necessitate a opportunity district. But if that's not the case, if having the majority, a part of the majority group in that district would dilute it and therefore not allow, as he was saying, the minority group to have their candidate of choice in there, then that's when you need to create a minority district. So it's very data-driven, fact-specific, but it's definitely a very strong possibility that we could have those as we redraw our map this next time. The other thing that I wanted to just elaborate on a little bit, Mr. Spino, was your question about whether or not the task force could present as a recommendation to the council to have an independent commission. I think you actually, part of your question was whether an individual task force member could come. So I just wanted to make sure that you all know that the task force has to give its recommendation to council as a body. So an individual would not be able to go and address council. And then just as a reminder that your charge is to come up with the criteria itself. So while you could say that in your recommendation to council, it is outside the scope of what council has put you here for. Any other questions?
Yeah, having said that, I know there will be a majority report, but if there was a part, like a minority report where it may not have carried the weight, that person could say, as part of a minority report, I strongly recommend an independent redistricting commission, right? And then to follow up on that, and this, you don't have to answer it today, but let's say the council in its infinite wisdom still declines to pursue an independent redistricting commission. The city charter does have some sort of ballot initiative or where you can get so many signatures to put that on the ballot in the May election, right? And,
there is an initiative process, yes.
And then if maybe, I don't know if you have that now, but maybe in the next meeting or somewhere you can at least provide what that would require and what the timelines are and how that would work.
Sure, we can provide. I don't have those details memorized, but I can certainly bring that.
Thank you so much.
Great. I have one question, Ms. Guzman. So since the communities of interest is so vague and no rules, set rules, can we as a task force define what we think a community of interest is?
You certainly could, yes. I mean, I would advise that you build some flexibility into that because it's going to be hard to come up with every potential scenario as those maps are drawn. So I know last time, for instance, one example would be there's a fairly decent sized retirement community that the line ended up going through the middle of. That's just an example. So you would want to make sure that's encompassed. So you might not have thought of that until you're actually drawing the map. So certainly you could include some of those. I would just advise you to bake in some flexibility there and not make it completely restrictive to only the things that you
But we have the flexibility.
But you could certainly make it inclusive and say including but not limited to, and then whatever communities of interest that you want to list.
Included but not limited to.
That's
one of the
legalese,
legal terms that
that's right.
Drives me crazy. Okay, one other question. So opportunity districts, as you said, are data-driven and they are racially driven.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I just want to put that on the record.
Could you give us an example, like with an existing district, like what it would have to show, like maybe on an existing district right now in Fort Worth, what the data would show and how that would play out, maybe so we can kind of understand?
So I'll read you the legal test, okay? So is the minority group sufficiently numerous and compact to be able to form a majority? That's number one. Number two, does the group tend to vote similarly? That's another reason you got to look at the data. And number three, does the majority vote differently from the minority, usually to defeat the minority's candidate? So if you had those three things, if you met that three-pronged test, then you could create a minority opportunity district.
A question on the majority, is that 50% voting age population or 50% or more citizen voting age population? There's a difference.
Yes, I believe that with the minority districts, it is voting age population, which is unlike when you draw all the boundaries. You got to, that you saw that population chart. That's all population. But when you do the minority opportunity district, it's voting age.
And do we have any opportunity districts or any of ours classified that way?
I believe so. I wasn't part of the last redistricting, but I mean, I would venture to guess probably District 5 is one. Possibly 8.
And I would say District 2, because traditionally in Fort Worth, Districts 5 and 8 have always, since Fort Worth went to single-member districts in the mid-70s, I would think that was 77, Districts 5 and 8 have elected African-Americans, and the only district in the city of Fort Worth that's ever elected a Hispanic-American is District 2.
District 2 has, as Mr. Spino well knows, has grown tremendously because of the pie shape. It goes from the north, it encompasses north side all the way up through Alliance, which is a very big population.
So what would you consider Como? So it's in a district, but how, is that a opportunity district or a minority majority? Because it's combined with other folks that may not vote as Como may vote.
It is, but one of the things that you also have to look at when you create those districts is the population size. I'm not sure that Como by itself would meet whatever population threshold we come up with when we divide everything by 10.
Okay, I got you. All right. Any other questions, colleagues?
Yes, this is Teresa. So is it possible that communities or certain districts could be opportunity districts? They could be multiple things. They could fall under multiple categories. Is that correct?
Could you clarify what you mean by falling under multiple categories?
Like you talked about, I don't have the slide up in front of me, but there was opportunity districts. There was something else that you talked about that we needed to when we were looking at the district. I just wondered if they could be classified differently.
I mean, if you're talking about communities of interest versus
Communities of interest?
opportunity
Okay.
districts.
Mr. Young.
So a community of interest would be more, I would think it would be a lot smaller of an area that you're trying to encompass into a district and not split up. Whereas a minority opportunity district is going to be a much larger area than I envision a community of interest being.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Guzman.
Right. This is Teresa again. Other than the criteria, are there any specific measurements? And I know you talked about, gave a percentage about 50%, but are there any other measurements that we need to be looking at when we're looking at governance of this?
I don't believe so. Since y'all are setting the general criteria, I think that you have a lot of leeway in how you as the chair mentioned, perhaps coming up with some specific communities of interest and that sort of thing. I can't think of any other percentages that this body would have to be concerned with. That will come in at the actual map drawing stage.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Great discussion. We're now on item 5 of our agenda. I had talked to Mr. Costa, and Ms. Ayala had also requested. One of the things that kind of I thought would be important for us is to have, well, let me back up. When I moved back home 4 years ago, I was just born and raised here, but being away for 34 years and coming back, and I'm in commercial real estate, so I'm looking for dirt to buy for clients. And so I got a chance to ride around Fort Worth a whole lot. And I was astonished by the growth. Areas that when I grew up were where we would go out and hunt jackrabbits were big multi-apartment complexes and stores and housing complexes. And so I thought that we would need to have a real good understanding of where the growth is in Fort Worth, who's doing the growth, ethically, what ethnicity, and kind of the incomes of people. Who are these folks that have come into our fair city? And this is going to be a big effect on how we decide on our criteria and procedures. And so Mr. Costa has asked Mark McAvoy, who is the Director of Planning and Data Analysis Department of the city, to come and brief us. Mr. McAvoy?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, you're welcome. So, Chairperson Miller and task force members, I appreciate the opportunity to come down and spend a little time and talk through these growth trends with you. And I can say from the outset that some of the slides that did not make it into this presentation are certainly ones that we can include as we distribute this out to the members via email. And they include things like income distribution and some other factors. We primarily focused here on race and ethnicity, talk about the growth and other demographic trends over the last, say, 30 years or so. At the outset here, I just want to add some clarity as we go through, and you'll see this in some of the citations. I presume everyone knows the U.S. Census is doing the decennial census, right? So there's that every 10-year population assessment, but then there's also something called the American Community Survey that happens every year, which is a sample of the population. And so you'll see those two terms mixed in these slides. And to the extent that we were able, we cited where we were using one source versus the other in some of these numbers. So keep your eye on that as we go through. Next slide, please. So just generally, big picture, starting from very high level, coming down to a more granular level. The population in general for the city of Fort Worth, the estimate as of July 1st, 2019 from the Census Bureau puts it at approximately 895,000, which places it 13th in rank in the United States. And you see the percentage change there at 21% essentially. But with respect to density, it's fairly low when compared to some of the others on this list. So it's third in growth rate, so growing very rapidly, 13th total overall in population, but 40th in density out of the top 50 on the list. And so if you look at just the kind of the area, Fort Worth, Dallas, and Arlington, over that 95-year window that you see there, looking out from left to right, as we approach the 2020 census, the estimate, and you'll see some different numbers, and the primary reason for that is that when we talk about projections, a couple of different sources for projections yield some different numbers, slightly different, not altogether grossly different, but you'll see there is an estimated population of 909,000 going out to 2045 as 1.4 million. And so if you look at the city itself, with respect to the overall breakdown of racial makeup, you see that since about 1990, the city has been what's referred to as a majority-minority city. We have a higher population of minority categories than we do of the majority category. And then as we go from left to right again, reaching to 2018 in the U.S. Census estimate that is provided by the American Community Survey, that really constitutes about a 62% minority population when you look at it categorically this way. Next slide, please. And if you compare that to Tarrant County, it is much higher in percentage with respect to majority-minority than the overall county, although over that 20-year period, Tarrant County will be catching up pretty rapidly. Next slide, please. Looking generationally, again, using the American Community Survey estimates, we look at the city of Fort Worth as compared to some of the other comparative, in this case, DFW as a region, state of Texas in the United States. The city of Fort Worth has a fairly young population, about 30%, is under the age of 18. And so when you compare that to DFW, about 28%, and then the United States at large, about a quarter of the population. So when compared to all of those other comparables, are higher in terms of population age. And you'll see this come up again in a future slide that we'll talk about when we get there. Next slide, please. This slide shows the current population, at least through 2018, of each council district. And so this slide, unfortunately, was sourced from an image, so it's a little hard to read. But as you can see, some of those population variances going through district by district. You've got a high population in District 7 of about 123,000 and a low population of District 9 of about 95,000, and then it spans as you go around there between those two numbers. Next slide, please. Here is the changing race and ethnicity makeup as we go from the year 2000 census through the estimate provided in 2019 for the 2018 year. And you can see there that when you put all of those pie charts together going from 2000 to 2018, the fastest growing category during that time is Hispanic category, and you see that it goes from 30% in 2000 to 34% in 2010 to 35% in 2018, and the prediction is that it will overtake and become the majority category in the city of Fort Worth in the next handful of years. And you can see the others as compared going between 2000 and 2018. Next slide, please. How does that translate into voting statistics? It is when you look at these are very closely aligned when you go from total population through voting age population through the number of total registered voters. Unfortunately for this presentation, we could not get the actual vote count broken down by race and ethnicity, but using these three categories, you can see there that we go from total population, which the numbers don't change much percentage-wise when you go from left to right. So when you look at total number of registered voters, the percentages are exactly the same as the other two categories. Next slide, please. So how does that impact an actual election? Well, if you look at the last two general elections in 2019 and 2017 respectively, you've got about 8.9 and 8.2% of the total number of registered voters voting. If you go back and look at that last pie chart, which represents about 388,000 registered voters, that's about 34,000 and 31,000 voters respectively in those two elections. So assuming at some point we can get that actual voter, ethnic, and racial breakout, that will tell us a more complete story here when we look at these percentages. Next slide, please. So these next four slides, as I go through them, is going to show kind of the changing demographic over the city between 1990 and 2018. And you can see here in 1990, the three colors that are represented in blue, orange, and yellow kind of represent the minority makeup of those census tracts that are a majority minority makeup. And so as you'll see as we go through these, those colors will expand throughout more and more of the city. So if we can go to the next slide, which represents the 2000 census, you'll see that those colors start to spread eastward and southwestward. And then if we go to the next slide, which is 2010, they go even farther eastward and farther westward and southwestward, and the city is becoming more diverse and less segregated. And then if we look at the estimate from 2015, even now we're seeing it progress northward, the concentrations eastward getting higher, the concentrations westward and southwestward getting higher, and it's becoming even more diverse and less segregated. And we expect for that trend to continue as the 2020 census numbers are revealed. Next slide, please. And one last thing to look at here, we have a category that's called super majority minority areas, where the population of a minority group is more than 75% of the total. And you can see the striations there going from kind of that gray color to the dark navy blue, which represents the highest concentration of a minority population. And as you recall, the previous 4 slides, those that area southeast of downtown going down 35 are where those highest concentration of minority populations are. This tracks with that in the supermajority minority areas if you compare those 5 slides together. That is all the information we have to present this afternoon. Obviously, we can supplement this with other data that you would like to see, but I would also be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Mr. McAvoy, please point out Loop 820 to me.
Sure.
Either it's real small, I can't see it. Ah. Okay. So beyond 820, that's in the white, that's out of Fort Worth.
Well, it's not out of Fort Worth. Those are just areas that are not super majority. I think the other chart that would be helpful is overall population growth, because there's been a boom in construction throughout Fort Worth, and that North Fort Worth area, north of 820, has exploded. He mentioned the North Fort Worth Alliance. I mean, that whole alliance, all that corridor north of 820, all the way up, because Fort Worth actually goes into as you go north, Denton County, it actually goes into Wise County. Then there's growth west out to Walsh Ranch. That's Parker County. And obviously, I don't know if Fort Worth goes into Johnson County. We do go into Johnson County. And then we hit Arlington, or else we're landlocked there on the east. So Fort Worth, we used to joke, Fort Worth's going to go all the way up to Oklahoma, because by the Speedway, we're in Justin, right? So,
so if you can back up one slide, I'll show you what we're talking about here. There's the city limit is what is represented in mostly green out to the west and north. So as you can see, it goes all the way up to that next tier that you're mentioning there, which encompasses quite a large area going both north.
Could you share what are the things that we encircle that aren't part of Fort Worth?
The city,
is that like
Saginaw,
and what's the one to the way to the north?
Is that Hazlitt? Is that Hazlitt up there?
Well, you've got Haltom, you've got North Richland Hills out.
I know that. No, there's some that we completely encircle.
Like right there by 35 and 20.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Saginaw.
Hazlitt and Saginaw?
Yeah.
Okay.
On Blue Mound, little
and
town
that's
called
all
Blue Mound.
within Fort Worth.
So the city of Fort Worth would surround those areas.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they vote their own city council, their own thing.
Right.
That's correct.
There are 41 incorporated areas in Tarrant County, Fort Worth obviously being the largest, followed by Arlington, and I think North Richland Hills is a third. But yeah, I think it'd be helpful if we had like a city council district overlay on all this, so we know how the council districts touch. I mean, I think you showed the map of the council districts, and you can see, I think you showed us where Council District 7 was uniquely shaped, because that one is, I think you showed that on population by council district. You can go back to that slide. I mean, so the reason it was done that way is, right there, 7, is because there was a lot of growth north of 820, Eagle Mountain area. Then it came inside kind of weird to capture the near west side and part of the cultural district, the Camp Bowie area. You know, it's kind of unique. And then Como is in Council District 3, surrounded by, all the other neighborhoods around that area. And then, of course, 9 is downtown. Most of downtown is in District 9, and part of it may be in District 2, and I believe, right? I'm trying to figure out where downtown is in there. And so there's been 2 growth patterns that I see. Outside 820, both north and south, and even west of 820, and then obviously the growth in the Hispanic population.
So, Mr. McAvoy, you mentioned that, I guess my question is, so we're looking for a 10% deviation generally? Was that in the last census when this population per council district was done? Was that?
From the 2010 census?
The 2010, yes. You mentioned that one of the districts had a small population.
Yeah, so according to this information, District number 9 has the
Yes.
smallest population with about 95,000-ish, and the largest is District 7 with about 123,000.
And what was the justification for that?
I'm not going to be able to answer that question.
If
I
I
don't
can
know.
say, Madam Chair, back then, it was, I think, either a 10% deviation, but the districts, it was, I think, 740,000 was the census population. So each district had to have 74,000. What this reflects is the growth since 2010. And so you can see which districts have grown. District 9, landlocked. Any development there would be downtown or the south side area along the Hempfield corridor and neighborhoods near TCU. So that's why there hasn't been as much population as in some of these other council districts, but that's growth since 2010. When the maps were done in 2010, each council district was within the 10% deviation. Is that correct, Fernando?
That is correct, Mr. Espino. What Mr. McAvoy is showing you is the most recent estimate of population, not the population as it existed when we created the districts. And I think one of the lessons that you might draw, not only from Mr. McAvoy's presentation, but from the comments that I believe Mr. Costello presented from Austin, as you draw the boundaries, you might want to consider having the rapidly growing districts having populations below the average, because you know they're going to go up. And the districts that are not growing so fast having greater populations, because proportionally they will be reduced in size. And so that's an art. You don't have to do that for legal reasons, but it makes good sense for reasons of fairness.
Great. Ms. Kennedy and others that are with us virtually, if you have questions, speak up. Ms. Kennedy?
Well, for example, Walsh Ranch is expected to have 50,000 people. So that would add 50,000 to District 3 as it's written right now. So when we look at that, we're going to have to make some extra plan for whichever district is that far west district.
I've driven Walsh Ranch in the last 7,000 acres, and much of it is undeveloped. But by the time we do the redistricting, there are going to be more people out there, as my mom would say, you can shake a stick at. So we're going to have to make accommodations for that. Other questions or observations, committee members?
Yes, this is Bill Schur. Can you hear me this time?
Got you, Mr. Schur.
You can. Okay. I had a question on slide 9, and it concerns the voter statistics. And so you may have explained this, and maybe I didn't quite pick it up while I was fiddling with trying to get my devices here to work. But in looking at this, the exact same percentages apply to total population, voting age population, and also the total number of registered voters. So that it just seems like that doesn't look like something that would be a coincidence. It doesn't quite look right to me. So I'm just wondering again, where do these numbers again come from? I mean, we have the total population by race and ethnicity, and according to this, the birth rate of, the number of voting age population tracks that exactly, even though, and the total percentage of registered voters, down to the 0.1%.
I think Mr. Schur's instincts are leading him to ask a valid question, and I think we need to double check these numbers. All the data that we know suggests that the Hispanic population, for example, tends to be younger.
Yes.
You would intuitively expect the voting age population percentage for the white population to be greater than the voting age population for Hispanics because the white population tends to be older. So you wouldn't expect those numbers to be identical. Furthermore, the data suggests that in general, that the white population tends to register to vote at a greater rate than does the Hispanic population because the Hispanic population consists heavily of immigrants and others who may not even be citizens. They're residents, but they may not be citizens of the United States. So I think Mr. Schur has asked a valid question, and I think we need to double check the data for you and verify it because it does seem at least curious that all the percentages align precisely from one pie chart to the next. It almost seems implausible, but we'll check.
And another thing I would say to that is that if you look at the sources here, there's some variability with respect to the point in time when each of these numbers was taken, just because of what they're representing. But to Fernando's point, we will triple check those and update this as necessary if there are changes to be included.
Mr. McAvoy, I just personally think your input and the data that you provide for us is going to be absolutely essential. So I would ask that you, if it's okay, to stay close to us, and when you have things that you think the task force should be aware of demographically, that you don't hesitate to make the task force aware of it, because I think this is absolutely important. If we don't know where people are and who they are, how can we make informed decisions? Is that okay? Mr. Espino?
Yeah, just one final comment. If you go to slide 10 on voter participation, obviously municipal elections and bond elections have very low turnout. The two there that stand out were 2003, that was an open mayor's race where Mayor Mike Moncrief was elected. That's like the high water mark, 14% of registered voters voted. And then in 2011 was an open mayor's seat. Mayor Moncrief had retired, and that was where Mayor Price was elected in 2011. So usually you get the greatest voter turnout in municipal elections when there's an open mayor's race. And then the other thing, and I don't have this data, maybe staff can get it, is the composition of municipal electorate tends to be older. Younger voters, millennials and folks under 40 don't vote as much in municipal elections as voters over 40, I think. So it'd be interesting to see what the composition is of voter turnout in municipal elections by age.
Yeah, well, and I have another question concerning the voter participation, and that has to do with, I know we're talking about city elections, and we're especially talking about city elections for elected representatives. But there are many other kinds of elections that we have within Tarrant, within Fort Worth, Tarrant County, and I am wondering if you analyze data by precinct, if you could, determine whether there are any, information that we might have about voters, and they're likely, they're voting in elections that are statewide and federal as well, that might inform us as to the existence of communities of interest or other people who might tend to vote similarly. It just seems to me that, that frankly, the voter participation in municipal elections is pathetic. I mean, it really is almost disgraceful. And these statistics of, the people who tend to vote, I don't know what information about who votes in these municipal elections shows about populations and as it would affect voting rights and opportunity districts, any of that stuff. I mean, it's just the fact that people don't vote doesn't tell me very much about who would be eligible to vote, who should vote. And, I mean, no matter how we draw the district lines, if people don't vote, you know, it doesn't, it just doesn't inform us of anything. That's my view on voter participation, that maybe it's a relevant factor, but I would like to know, you know, how in the process why we view city of Fort Worth voting patterns to define who lives in a particular area and their general demographics.
Ms. Kennedy?
Mr. McAvoy, as we move forward with this, is there a way for you to have for us, like, these maps with various overlays that we can look at, like with the demographics, with like by race, by age, by kind of our communities of interest or our income, any of those sorts of information? I don't know what all kinds of demographic information you have available to you, or how we can see that, or how we can access that.
To the extent that those data points exist in the census and ACS data, yes, we can provide all of that you've described.
Thank you so much.
Right. Any other questions of Mr. McAvoy?
This is Teresa. To Ms. Kennedy's point, yes, I'd like to see, I'm looking at the population per council district, and I'd like to see a little bit more information, and I think Mr. Spino alluded to it, that some of these areas are landlocked, and some of these there might be, you know, you have River Oaks, you have Sampson Park, you have some of these areas that are kind of in the midst of all of this, so anything that we can have that kind of maps out where they are, even if it's just so that we can kind of see where there's opportunities for growth, as there is, I think somebody mentioned about over in the west side. But if we can just see those a little bit more clearly on one of these maps, that would be very helpful for me. And I think it would be helpful for the rest of us as well, too, so that we can kind of look to see where there's potential growth and when there's really nobody that's going to be able to, you know, to move into that area because they are landlocked. So I just would like to see that.
Ms. Ayala, may I add to that? Is it possible, Mr. McAvoy, that we could see each council district, the current, what was the 2010 population, and then what the projections are now, so we can, does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, I
trying to get
also
something
think
that we can all grasp.
I think that I'm sorry, I see call-in user 5. I don't know who that is. Teresa,
yes.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to was what I was going to suggest too is, you know, I know in the school board we have a demographer who gives us number of potential housing starts, open vacant lots. If we could know that information around the city to know where there's opportunity for growth, it doesn't guarantee that growth will happen, but I know that information is collected and available. So if we can get that would be helpful.
But for me, I'd almost not like to see it by district, because
no, just in general.
I would like to look at the city as a blank slate. If we're going from 6 to 10, I don't want to look at it by district, because I don't want to have in my head
that 8 looks like this, and that's
right,
because all of that may change. Okay, I agree.
Yeah.
Now that I think about it, talking off the top of your head, just thinking out loud. But then when you stop and think about it, you don't want to, I guess for lack of a better word, prejudice yourself in thinking this is what it's going to be. Any other questions?
Well, I'll just conclude parenthetically by saying, when you ask the question, is it possible? We have some pretty talented GIS folks, so
I hear
the possibilities are limitless. We just need to know what you would like to see, and we can probably provide it.
From this conversation that you've heard from the task force and the questions, do you have a good sense of what we would like to see?
We do, yes.
Oh, good. Thank you, Mr. McAvoy, because we don't, probably, all of it.
And I have a question also. I have a question along these lines, and that is that as individual members of this task force, if there is something specific that we should want from Mr. McAvoy or from any of the other city staffers, information that we would like to see, what is there? Do we simply shoot off an email to the staff or saying we would like this? Do we funnel this through the secretary's office? Or
I would strongly suggest that we send it to Mr. Fernando Costa and let him parcel it out as he sees fit. And Mr. Costa is coming to the podium now.
Yes, ma'am. If each interested member of the task force would let me know what additional information you would like, we would like to do as we normally do when we get requests from the city council. If one member of the council requests information that would be relevant to the entirety of the council, then we send that information back to everybody. So it may be just one of you makes a request, but if it seems relevant to what the whole task force is discussing, we'll make sure everybody has access to the same information.
Right. And that was the principle Mr. Costa used with this request from me and from Mrs. Ayala.
Yes, ma'am.
We wanted to make sure everybody, not just me and Ms. Ayala, but the entire task force had the information. And I think you see the benefit of doing that way. So if you just let Mr. Costa know.
It sounds as though you've asked enough questions, good questions, that it might make sense at your next meeting that we come back to you with a follow-up briefing on additional demographic data that are relevant to redistricting.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. That's why I suggested to Mr. McAvoy, stay close. Okay. Thank you. You know, I'm thumbing through stuff and I missed, here it is, the agenda. Okay. Mr. Costa, I would hope that you could, we're going to have an open discussion, ladies and gentlemen, about the potential criteria and procedures. Now, I was trying to find the 2010 criteria and procedures that we received at some point, and
we discussed them at our last meeting. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, and I was trying to find it.
It was.
No, we had the.
It was slide 4 of the redistricting task force PowerPoint. That had the 2011 redistricting criteria.
That's correct.
Yeah, slide 4.
Kaiser's trying to find that presentation, and if we can find it, we'll project it on the screen.
Redistricting task force, September 17, 2020. It was
17, 2020, and page.
Slide 4. There's like 10 criteria.
Redistricting task force on citizen participation, or the regular one. There we go. I knew I had seen it.
Okay. Ms. Guzman will read them off for us, for the record.
Okay, the first one was establishing districts that are relatively equal in size, ensuring that geographically compact minority neighborhoods are not fragmented and minority voters not packed into districts so as to create liability under Section 2 of the VRA. Number 3 was avoid retrogression under Section 5 of the VRA, but remember that's no longer applicable. Compact and contiguous districts. When appropriate, dividing districts by easily identifiable geographic districts. When appropriate, recognizing neighborhoods and communities of interest. When appropriate, establishing districts that include areas located both inside Loop 820 and outside Loop 820. When appropriate, establishing districts composed of whole census blocks and whole voting precincts, and preserving incumbent/constituent relationship.
Thank you, thank you. Colleagues, are there any additions or deletions? Mr. Costa, do you?
Yes, I think the purpose of listing this item on your agenda at your request is to create an opportunity for the task force members to engage in an initial discussion, not to reach any conclusions necessarily today, but initial discussion about what you would like to explore more thoroughly in respect to criteria and procedures based on what you've heard from staff and from the experts from Austin and San Antonio. So for example, at your first meeting, I believe it was Mr. Espino who suggested a couple of criteria that may warrant further discussion, such as the radial pattern or the pie-shaped pattern of the council districts. That is fundamental. Now, historically, the council has observed the rule of creating districts that span out, most of which span out from the central city. The purpose being that we don't want to create an us versus them relationship between the central city and the outlying parts of Fort Worth. And so you get over that by making sure that they radiate from the central city. You heard a similar comment from Mr. Costello in Austin. They made sure that most of their districts crossed I-35 so that there would not be an us versus them relationship between east and west of I-35. So that is now that's going to be a harder challenge after the 2020 census and with the addition of 2 council districts. It's going to be much harder to create the majority of the districts that radiate from the center of Fort Worth. Still possible, perhaps, but more challenging, particularly when you weigh that objective against other objectives that may be equally compelling to the city council or whoever's redrawing the district lines. Another criterion that may warrant discussion is whether you want to consider incumbent constituent relationships. One of the presenters this afternoon talked about considering existing council districts. Now, you've already heard from Ms. Kennedy, you ought not to have that in your mind at all. So do you want to take existing districts and modify them, or do you want to start with a blank slate? Those are 2 different approaches. And so, again, we're not expecting the task force today to reach any conclusions, but you might find it useful to engage in some preliminary discussion about those kinds of issues or any other issues that you think are relevant. And if you need any further research from staff, we can conduct that research before you come back for your next meeting.
Great. Let's have a discussion. What's your pleasure, colleagues?
I want to reiterate.
Yeah.
I want to reiterate, and I agree with Ms. Kennedy, the incumbent, it's going to be a new slate. We're going to 10 single-member districts in 2023. I think we need to have further discussion of that, but I'd be in favor of removing that as a criteria. And when you go to 10 single-member districts, it's going to be hard to do the inside Loop 820 and outside Loop 820, but so I would be fine striking that out, but I'm only one member of this task force, but that's my viewpoint.
What's your pleasure? Because that was a concern for me, because but I wanted to make sure that we had an open discussion about it. So what's your pleasure? Ms. Kennedy, we've heard from you. Ms. Scott, everybody, what do you think?
Think about what, the single member, or, I'm sorry?
I'm sorry?
Oh, clean slate? Yeah, I would agree. I think a clean slate. I think the inside and outside of Loop 820 is going to be challenging. I think, obviously, the current members, I would say, if it happens that way, it happens that way, but I wouldn't necessarily consider that. I think one of the things that jumped out at me that is interesting is even the whole notion of equal in size. I mean, I believe they need to be equal in terms of population, but I think knowing what we know about Fort Worth and its density and lack thereof, I think that's perhaps one I would take out. I don't know that, and clearly, if you look at what they are currently, they're not equal in they're not.
Yeah, that was my question about District 9
geographic
when Mr.
size.
McAvoy made that.
So,
okay. Mr. Vito?
I was going to add, Madam Chair, District 9 started off being around the average, but the other districts have grown more rapidly, and therefore it looks like it hasn't come close to the other districts. It started off being around the average, maybe even a little more than the average, and it's actually grown, but not as fast as the other districts have grown.
It's because it's Central City.
Yes.
It's downtown,
Right.
basically.
Right. Now, downtown has actually grown, but
Yes,
but
it
other
has.
parts of District 9 have not grown as fast. District 9 is all entirely within Loop 820. It's the only one that's entirely within Loop 820.
Perhaps
So,
not.
so we want to start off with all the districts plus or minus 5% from the average. I would suggest that the District 9, and when we come back to you next time, we'll show you some population forecasts from the Council of Governments. So you'll see which ones are growing or expected to grow and which ones are not expected to grow as fast. And so if you find that an area like District 9, or not necessarily District 9 specifically, but that geography of District 9, if it's not growing as fast, then you probably want to put an extra amount of population in those slower growing districts. In the fast growing districts, like the equivalent of District 7, or the equivalent of District 3 out to Walsh Ranch, those you want to start off below. So if the 2020 population of Fort Worth is, let's say it's 900,000, use a round number, and you can have 10 districts, the average of each district will be 90,000. So you might want to take 90,000 minus 5%, and that's where you would set the high growth districts, 90,000 plus 5% for those slow growth districts. But you got to be plus or minus 5% in order to meet the legal standard, if that makes sense.
So I think my comment slightly misconstrued, and this is where maybe my suggestion then is just to clarify. When I think of relatively equal in size, I'm thinking of square mileage, and 7 is humongous, and 9 is, and 8, they're so vastly different in terms of the amount of land they encompass.
Right. They will not be equal in size in land
I would
area.
change the wording because I think what we're saying is equal in population.
That's a good clarification, Mr. Allen. It should say, you may wish to say it's equal in population because in land area, it just wouldn't make sense.
Right. Okay.
I do like how in several of these, there's kind of wiggle room where it says when appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
That gives, some room for if it's not appropriate, because it may not always be appropriate to have a distinguishable geographic border.
Okay.
Giving whomever ultimately draws the lines some sort of grace when it comes to being able to do things in a fashion that makes good sense for our community. But I do think that there are some things like relatively equal in size where we could use better language.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd like to say that, I have studied a lot of the various local redistricting factors considered by cities that have taken the position that they wanted to have some kind of independent redistricting commission. And they seem to be fairly uniform in structure. And generally speaking, they all throw out the preserving incumbent constituent relationship factor. Most of them also begin with the criteria that emphasize compliance with the United States Constitution and the Voting Rights Act. And the wiggle room typically is going to be with the features not when appropriate, but they'll say things such as, well, we want to have compact and contiguous districts, but not if it has the impact of adversely affecting the ability to meet the basic voting rights requirements. And I think these are, so I would like to see us come up with, take a look at multiple cities that have looked at redistricting factors recently, find the language that they've used, and sort of pick out the ones that we think are really best and most appropriate for our city. And I know that things like, compact and contiguous districts, a contiguous district, you want everything to be touching, and there's some that, but, touching at a single point with two polygons touching at a single point, that's not a contiguous district. We don't really have definitions of some of these terms. But I generally think that I think we should, I agree with the position that we should start new, and that, we should let the chips fall where they were, and that, we will try to do these things, but we need to prioritize which specific factors in which order are most important. And so that's why I do strongly suggest starting off with compliance with the U.S., with the Constitution and with the Voting Rights Act, and then making the others that we choose, such as compact and contiguous, be subject to not interfering with the other basic purposes of the redistricting process.
Thank you.
Bill, if you've got a list of other cities that you think we should look at, can you send those to Mr. Costa so he can share those with the rest of the committee?
I will do that, and I'm continuing to study it. So it's somewhat random. It has it's the typical kind of thing you would get if you Google municipal redistricting, and you find out that there are many cities that have come up with different approaches, and they have interesting rules about. They also deal with such subjects of the procedural things we're going to be looking at, such as determining conflicts of interest, determining who are going to be independent advisors should we choose to, and how much staffing is provided, who pays for what, who draws the. There's all kinds of stuff out there, but I will share my research on all that, and I'll send that to Mr. Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Schurer, because I've been looking out there myself and talking to folks that I know around the country that have been involved in this, and you're absolutely right. So I think if we can, I don't think we want to necessarily strike stuff today, but I think we're on a general consensus that preserving incumbent and constituent relationship, we can strike that. Is Mr. DeVito?
Well, since you brought that up, I would like to know about that. I feel like we should at least give some consideration. These folks have worked very hard to achieve their positions, and without any consideration at all, we could end up with 2 or more current council members in one redistricted location. We're basically telling 2 of those 3 people you can no longer serve the city unless you want to move and take on another location. So I personally want to know if that information is available. I'd like to have that, maybe to a lesser extent for some of the other factors, but I do at least want to know that.
Okay.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think probably most of us on this group, we wouldn't be on this group if we did not have close relationships with the council members who appointed us. Now that said, I mean, generally speaking, when you start holding neighborhoods and things like that together, you are going to probably naturally keep a lot of these things together. But if you're then talk about, well, once we draw up the map, let's now make a gerrymander to just carve out so that somebody doesn't have to move, that's not particularly, it's okay, I suppose, but it's not going to sit well with a lot of people who are looking for independence. And I think right now, at a time when we do have, a large number of people within our city who are deeply concerned about the composition of the council and good old boy systems, things of that nature, that it's really, truly, it is best to not consider this as a factor.
Okay,
I mean, it's good to know the information, and maybe some minor adjustments can be made, and some little trade-offs here and there, but it should be, if it is in there, it should be at the bottom, just like it is on this chart.
Okay. Ms. Guzman has clarification she wants to make, and then we'll go to Mr. DeVito.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, when y'all are looking at the other cities, I would encourage you to narrow and focus in on what those redistricting criteria were. Some of the stuff that, for example, the independent commissions have advised council on is not applicable here. So that you can, I know that one of the things that y'all talked about last time in terms of making sure that your time is well spent, to make sure that y'all are focused in on the things that will be beneficial to you all and making your final determinations on what the council's asked you to do. And then the other thing, just to remind you, I know Mr. Schur was talking about looking at somebody that had redistricted recently. I don't know if there'll be any opportunities to redistrict for anybody except for right after the last census. So you're going to be looking right around that 2011-12 time frame. So when y'all are looking, that's kind of the time frame you'll look at.
Thank you, Ms. Guzman. Mr. DeVito?
Yes, Madam Chair, we've been talking about overlays, map overlays. The information that I would like to see generated would be voting precincts, if we can know exactly the locations of the voting precincts and the census blocks. And of course, we're looking at the ethnicity percentages. That's going to be updated as much as possible. I'd also like to know where the county lines are, since we have multiple counties. And I think, was it Austin that said they had multiple counties in their redistricting? They tried to keep the county interests together. I think that's something that we should probably look at. And then, of course, major roads and arterials and highways, those are other factors. But those are, I think, the main things that I would like to see generated in map overlays.
Can we have a 2 or 3 minute discussion going back to, I think, what Mr. Costa said? Do we want a clean map approach, or do we want to look at the existing council districts and see what we do with them to carve out the 2 extra districts that we're going to need? So I just want us to get a sense of.
I might jump in there. I feel like there's a pretty good consensus on at least seeing what it looks like from a clean start. But then yes. To your point, I know that we're not gonna be able to pretend that we don't know where these folks live, and there's certainly interest there too. I guess my question is, and it's kind of what I've been struggling with a little bit in thinking about all of this, is if we go clean slate, what's our first starting point to try and draw a map, and then begin to plug in some of these other things that we think are really a big priority? Like, what's the first, we're going to throw some lines up there and see where then start plugging in data and all of that. How do we start? What's the first criteria to start with?
Ms. Kennedy, and I thought the Austin folks said it was the central city.
Madam Chair, Madam Chair, all we're doing is giving the criteria.
Right. That was the point I was.
All we're doing is this list.
Right. That was the point I was going to make. I don't want you all to spend too much time on things that aren't under your purview, just because we want to be respectful of your time. So going too far off into the field of the maps may not be beneficial to you. Your task is just to decide a list of things for the map makers later to use when they make the maps. So this is the kind of list you're going to come up with. Very similar, I would assume, at the end of the day to this. Obviously not exactly, but it will not be down to the granular level of needing to know even demographics to a certain extent. That's going to be the map maker's job to look at that.
But kind of, we do need to know some of the demographics because we
Yes.
may need to add some of that information in there because some of that might be important to us to say, this demographic information is important as an important factor in redistricting, that one of the factors that you need to look at is this level of demographic data in our city in order to make districts that represent our city. If you're not looking at, we have 5 different counties represented and we want each of those we think that it's important that the people in Johnson County are all in one district together and the people that are in Parker County are all in one district together. That's important for us to be able to say.
Absolutely.
So
I agree with
demographic
that.
information and geographic information is important for us to know.
It informs what we do
Yes.
with, on the criteria and our procedures. I don't see how we can make good informed decisions without it. Mr. DeVito.
Madam Chair, are we not generating a map out of this discussion at any point? We're not going to present any sort of a...
Let me just say, we could do a sample map, I guess, based on what we see.
It would be outside the purview of your charge from council.
And I guess I get that. It's just, to me, we're going to have to begin to look at some of those things. And I just don't see that our charge is also doesn't prohibit us from looking at those things. Yeah. And if we have just a list that we're handing them, you can basically take that and use it in any way. You can backfill it to fit any set of criteria. But if we could demonstrate, here's what the criteria is, and here is how it works. Here's how it could make us fairer. Here's how it could make these districts more representative. Here's how we could plug it in and actually make it work. And we're not saying that this is what you have to follow, but it could work. And here we've looked at it and it could work. I just think that could be a possibility.
Mr. Costello.
Let me see if I can reaffirm what you've already heard. At your last meeting, we brought to you a demonstration of the Geographic Information System software. The purpose of it was not to make you experts or not even to suggest that you need to know how to use that software. You don't. It's intended to help you gain a better appreciation how the council will be using the software and how ordinary residents will be able to use the software to propose council district maps. Now, I think the point is well taken that one possible use of that software by this task force would be to apply your draft criteria and determine whether or not those criteria are useful. So if that's beneficial to you, then you should feel free to draw maps. Now, we currently don't have access to the software for use by the city. We have not acquired the software yet. And we're not expecting you to use the software, and we won't even have the actual data until well after the task force is dissolved, when you submit your final report in March. But if you want to consider what a potential council district maps would look like using current population estimates, you're free to do so. And our staff is happy to help you. But I would reiterate what you've heard from our law department, that drawing maps is beyond the scope of the charge that the council has given you. In fact, I recall when the council had a discussion about creating this task force, we were advised, do not let the task force draw maps. Now, you can say you're just experimenting. You're not submitting any maps. That's not your charge to recommend maps. But if you want to draw maps just to help you gain a better appreciation for the criteria, then I don't see anything wrong with that.
And Mr. Costa, just to follow up, for citizens, I believe in the last redistricting, there were citizen groups that
Yes, ma'am.
proposed some maps.
And we encourage that, yes.
Yes.
That was
and
after
absolutely.
the criteria were set.
Yeah, okay.
We said, here, use these criteria to draw maps. And that's, we've been spending all our time talking about criteria. The other part of your charge is talk about procedures.
Procedures, yes.
So you will want to recommend a set of procedures that allows for residents to create their own maps and submit them well before the council starts to draw their own maps. So they should be informed and
let me reiterate to the task force, we have an agreement that we will have a work session with the council as they start to draw the line. So we sunset in March, but the council probably will not start drawing the lines until August or September.
Right, August is when they should have access to the data.
And so we will have a work session with them so that we can help them. Part of what I think our responsibility is to give them our best thinking, since we're going to spend a whole lot of time on thinking of criteria and procedure, and to share with them what we've come up with. Out in woo-woo land, do you have any questions?
Yes. With respect to procedures, I do note that this particular task force is, we are to advise the city council about redistricting criteria and procedures that the city council should use in the future. It's not specific as to just this very next election. And what happens is that, I do think that when it comes down to procedures, what I am seeing is that there is a great demand on the part of at least some segments of the public to have access not just to information about, well, this is who did this and who did that and who was in favor of this and what is the reason for this, but also to have actual access to the kinds of tools and information that is used by the real map makers. I mean, so the citizens, it's all fine and good to say that citizens can draw their own maps, and I guess the question gets to be, what resources do they have available to them? Will the city licenses, for example, allow them to have it? Will they be allowed to use the same software? I mean,
Mr. Costa?
The answer is yes.
The same data.
The same resources that the city council would have would be available to any resident of Fort Worth.
And so that's part of it seems to me that is part of when we go through the educational process that we discussed earlier. The most important thing to me that will persuade the public that this is going to be a fair process, and they can have the ability to make informed comment that will be considered, would be some very upfront statements saying these are some of the things that you can do, the same data will be available to you, and these things sometimes actually appear in ordinances and procedures that councils actually adopt as such. I don't think that is necessarily needs to be in the city's code or charter or anything like that, but many cities are actually now starting to include that kind of language as part of what they actually build in to establish rapport with the citizens.
Thank you.
That's certainly within your prerogative to recommend. I'll remind you that you heard from some citizens at your last meeting that their concern was not so much citizens not having access to the same resources, which they did, but the concern that once the citizens submitted their maps, they went into this black hole, and we didn't hear from anybody until they came out with the magic map. And so promotion of transparency is another issue that folks have raised.
Yes, Mr. Sure.
part of what I've seen in Austin, San Antonio, is that in general, as changes are made to the maps, there are explanations given as to why these things were done, why they made certain adjustments. There is a sequence of processes. Someone comes up with an initial map or maps. Someone says, let's work with this particular, we like this general map. Then they start going into the finer points and making adjustments. Well, this particular map that the computer helped come up with disregards this community of interest, and there are explanations and a track record for everybody to see, and the citizens actually have been given the opportunity to say, because there are several iterations of the map, we don't like this particular map because it does this and it shouldn't, and like the Austin folks did. So I guess that's what I'm thinking of as being the kinds of things that would be procedural, that this task force would be asked to say, okay, here are the criteria that are going to be used, but it would not be limited to saying here are the criteria that would be used and the procedures to be used by the map makers, but it would also, include some of these procedures that say this is going to be part of the citizen review process and the record that will be available to them and so on and so forth. And I don't know if that's consistent with what we were asked to do or not, but I think it is under paragraph 2 of the resolution.
This is Ken. I had a comment real quick.
Right, surely. Go ahead.
So it's been said a number of times, and Lorraine, you led off the meeting, by noting that we shouldn't be talking about independent redistricting. It's not part of our purview. We've also been told, and Mr. Costa has been pretty clear that we're here to give a list of points to use and then some procedures. The whole thing is like whether we strike the preserving incumbent constituent relationship. I mean, the point is almost moot because we're going to have elections in May. We're going to have a new mayor, city council, etc. And then these people are going to come in the fall, just having one election, and they're not going to take the map and start with a blank slate. I mean, who are we kidding? They're going to say they may play with some things on the margins and this and that and the other, but it's not going to be, wholesale different than the map that we have right now. They're going to, they're going to wrangle hard to lose as much power as they can to create 2 new districts and and make it sound good. So I just don't understand. We shouldn't kid ourselves because they're going to do what's expedient and what's good for them.
And Mr. Bradshaw, I in some respects, I agree with you wholeheartedly, but I think what we have to, a charge that we have is to make sure the public is aware of this. I don't think the council can kind of go in a smoke-filled room and draw the maps without some degree of sunlight. And part of what I think we should do, and the recommendations that we've had from the previous redistricting, is that we draw the public into this so that they do have a voice, and be that as it may. Now, the charter, I agree with you. The frustration is that when the council did the charter, they said, we are the king and queens, and we're going to decide how the lines are going to be drawn. Given that they chose to do that, and they asked us to come up with the criteria and the procedures, I think it's up to us to really throw some light on the process, and I think we do that in the development of our criteria and the development of our procedures that is tied in with demographic information so that we know what we're doing. Then I don't think they can sit in a smoke-filled room and do this totally among themselves. Now, I appreciate incumbency. Well, I won't tell you that story, but I think this is. I think we're on the right process to do what, if we still try to keep what is in the best interests of the residents of Fort Worth in mind, at uppermost in our mind, regardless of incumbency, I think we're on a good path. And I think the kind of criteria and the procedures that we're going to come up with will reflect that and help the council as they actually draw the lines. That's the ultimate purpose here, I think, given that they are the actual drawers of the line. Now, I'd like to, this has been a fabulous discussion, but I'd like to bring it to a close. We have lots to think about, a lot of food for thought. I think Mr. McAvoy's presentation, we're going to have to pore over and really internalize the data that he's given us. And if we could, I'd like to, and I appreciate the participation of everybody. Ms. Ayala, did you have a final something that you wanted to say?
Yes, can you hear me okay? Hear me okay? Hello?
Go ahead. You're on mute. You're on mute. Take yourself off mute.
I called on my phone. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you now.
Okay. So the only, there's some noise in the background, but the only question that I really had wanted clarification on is, are there any things on this criteria list that we need to possibly look at that the previous task force, agriculture, the task force submitted that maybe we didn't include in here? Hello?
Oh, say again. I'm sorry.
I said, that's okay. I said, the only clarification I had was was there anything from the Race and Cultural Task Force that they may have looked at this criteria, that they made any recommendations that are not reflected here?
Mr. Costa.
No, the Task Force on Race and Culture did not recommend any specific criteria that are not included here. They did strongly urge the council to consider an amendment to the city charter requiring use of an independent redistricting commission. That recommendation was not accepted by the council, and instead the council decided to create this task force. But to answer Ms. Ayala's question specifically, no, there are no specific criteria that the task force recommended that are not on the list that you've seen.
Ms. Ayala, at the beginning in my remarks, I reiterated a goal that the Race and Task Force Commission recommended, that as we create, as the districts are created, that when drawn would provide the best opportunities to elect council members who reflect the diversity population of the city.
Okay.
Okay? All right. If it's okay, can we move on? Like to close that discussion. That was good. Task force members, we're now to number 7, future meetings. And if you'll take note of it, I went on and put these meetings on my calendar already. The January dates, and when we do the redistricting 101 for these various groups, will probably be the first of the year, I think, because you don't want to do it in November and December. Everybody is in the holiday mood, and now that we're deeply into COVID, we don't want to get involved in all of that. And so if folks feel that they can come out in person, or if we want to do this by virtually, it's good. Then we have February, March, and then we have our report to the council. So if you would put those on your agenda and your calendars, that would be helpful. I strongly urge you, as Ms. Ayala has done, as I have done it, and Mr. Shore has requested, if you have agenda items, and as we've been talking and thinking through things tonight, once you get home and you have a glass of tea, something may come to your mind. If you would please let us know, let me and Mr. Costa know that you've got a possible agenda item. Please do that, because it may make for a longer meeting, but I think a very fruitful meeting, and that's what we're trying to do. Now, we're down to number 9 now. Before we get to our public presentations, I want to make sure Mr. Costa and Mrs. Kaiser, are there any housekeeping issues that you want to make? Everybody had to do your open meetings certifications. Ms. Kaiser, do you have anything you want to add?
No, there's a couple of folks that still need to get me their certificates, so I'll email you separately and let you know that. And for those of you who may need a parking pass, come see me before you leave, and I have those for you. So that's all I have.
Okay. Mr. Costa, do you have any housekeeping issues?
Two things. One suggestion has come up as to whether you'd like to begin your meetings at 3 o'clock rather than 4 in view of the length of time that these meetings are taking. We originally thought that you'd have meetings that would not exceed 2 hours in length, but last time we went 2.5 hours. Today we'll probably be going 3 hours. So you may wish to think about whether you want to keep meeting at 4 or consider meeting next time at 3 o'clock. That's entirely up to the task force.
And one of the reasons is he's bringing that up. Thank you, Mr. Costa.
Yes, ma'am.
Let me interject here, because we have 9 presentations today from citizens. So part of what we want to do as a task force is get their opinions in the mix here. And so we have 9 today. He thought that maybe we start at 3, and if we still have this amount of citizen participation, they have 3 minutes each to make a presentation to us. So what's your pleasure?
Start at 3 o'clock.
Saying what, Tracy?
3 o'clock.
3? If you think 3 is good, raise your 3. There you go, Miss Ayala. Mr. Shearer, what do you say? 5? 3, Mr. Shearer? Mr. Bradshaw? Okay, I think we have a general consensus, Mr. Costa, that 3 will work.
All right, we will, Ms. Kaiser, if we can reserve this room for 3 o'clock on November 19th, and she'll send out a WebEx invitation that I believe will say 2:30, because we want to start the WebEx at 2:30, but the meeting will be at 3, and we'll post it accordingly. And the agenda for your next meeting, in addition to including discussion of preliminary findings, if you would like to have a basis for that discussion, we will prepare for you a draft set of criteria and procedures, and you can start taking target practice on it. But at least you'll have a starting point for discussion based on what we heard you say today. And we'd also like to present to you, we'd like to ask Mr. McAvoy to come back with the additional demographic data that you've requested. And we'd like to ask Ms. Goot, Michelle Goot, our communications director, to brief us on Redistricting 101, the seminar that you've requested to educate the public so that they can participate more effectively in the public hearings, that we would be holding. So we'd like to come back to you. One of these suggestions is to produce a video that we could show at that seminar and make available to citizen groups to use at their convenience to educate the public about what redistricting involves. And then we'll also come back to you with proposed dates and arrangements for the public hearings. They could be conducted in a hybrid format, as Ms. Good has explained. When we did the budget meetings a few weeks back, we actually had provisions whereby someone could come live at the council chamber and speak in person, or they could communicate just as effectively as we're doing tonight remotely. So we can come back to you with those proposed arrangements for your review and discussion. We'll have plenty to discuss next time.
Groovy smoothie. Okay. If all minds are together, we can go to our public presentations. Ms. Kaiser, would you tell us who they are and the order?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, we're dialing the first one. The first one will be Fernando Flores. And at your places, those of you who are here, you have the handout that he provided in advance. So you have some materials from some of our presenters. Others do not have any, so.
Yes.
Mr. Flores, this is Mary Kaiser. You're on the line with the Redistricting Task Force, and you have 3 minutes.
Right now?
Yes, right now.
Good evening, members of the Redistricting Task Force. Ms. Miller, it's a pleasure to be here. I've been watching the meeting, and I want to thank you all for doing such a great job. Now, I only have 3 minutes, so I need to run through this. And
yes,
by this time, so I'm online, right? So,
yes, you are, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, by this time, you should have a copy of the recommendations. And let me back off a little bit. I'm Fernando Flores. I reside at 2740 Hemp Hill, and I'm the representing here this afternoon the United Hispanic Council of Tarrant County. And let me just run through these real quickly. I'm not going to read everything that I put down, but you should have a copy, like I said. Number one, we recommend that the Fort Worth City Council create an independent redistricting commission to do Fort Worth City Council redistricting. And we have a good explanation there that I think you all should read. Number two, we recommend strict adherence to the Voting Rights Act when drawing city council maps, regardless of which method of redistricting is used. And I think that Ms. Miller brought up a good point a while ago, and when she was talking about communities of interest. Shouldn't communities of interest, and that is race and ethnicity, should be at the top of the hierarchy to consider. And that's if Fort Worth is serious about inclusion and diversity at the city council, which will be in the indication. So that's what we're interested in. We're minorities. There's a long history. I, for one, have been participating in city council redistricting for 3 previous census cycles. So I'm very much aware of what's been going on. And I'll have to say that it hasn't been fair, I don't think. It's all been about independent incumbent interest, and at times very ugly. So adhere to the Voting Rights Act and to the communities of interest, minority communities of interest, where it's possible to create opportunity districts for minorities. You should do it. You should recommend that to the council. Now I'm going to go to number 3, and again, we recommend that regardless of the redistricting method used, that the residents of incumbents not be protected to assure that no more than one ends up in the same district. This has been something that I have seen in other redistricting cycles.
Mr. Flores, your 3 minutes is up. It goes by really fast.
Okay, so now I don't have anything else to say, right?
Right.
Mr. Flores, we have your paperwork, and we'll all read it with much interest. Thank you.
And I will be sending some more to you prior to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kaiser.
You're welcome. Our next speaker will be Pablo Calderon, and you have some information from him as well.
This is Pablo.
Mr. Calderon, this is Mary Kaiser. You're on the line with the Redistricting Task Force, and they're ready for your comments, and you have 3 minutes.
Should I turn down my speaker, or
Yes.
can I?
Yes, if you would.
Okay.
That way we won't get feedback.
Okay, I've turned it down, but I can still watch, and I'm next.
And yes,
Okay.
you're ready to go.
My name is Pablo Calderon, and I live in Kellyanne Grace District. Some amended thoughts from what I wrote down originally. And these thoughts are on the redistricting criteria adopted June 7th, 2011. 2 criteria read like an attorney advising a client on how to comply minimally with the letter of the law, not a full embrace of the spirit of the law. Criteria number 2, the districts should assure that voting rights of racial and language minorities to participate in the electoral process and to elect candidates of their choice are not diluted. Not diluted should be changed to strengthened. Criteria number 3, the proposed districts should assure that voting rights of racial and language minorities under the current single-member district plan are not adversely affected. Not adversely affected is the minimum. The key goal of having 10 districts is to strengthen minority representation. Possible criteria include that minority communities should not be cracked or fragmented into several districts, none or fewer of which are minority opportunity districts. And minority communities should not be packed or concentrated into a small number of districts, such that their votes are wasted where their preferred candidate will win by an overwhelming majority. Minority opportunity districts must have at least 50% minority voting age population. Criteria number 7 should be amended. And that has to do with areas inside and outside Loop 820. That's acceptable if communities of interest exist. A statistical analysis of past council election results will be needed to determine the degree of racially polarized voting. Looking at that lets you know whether, in fact, there are communities of interest inside and outside Loop 820. And finally, the criteria number 10, it's a conflict of interest permission pass, but we trust that a process will be set up that will be equitable and fair. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Bruce Miller, and he is here. And let me get his PowerPoint up for you.
I want y'all to know that Mr. Miller and I are related.
Okay, Mr. Miller, I have your PowerPoint up. If you'll just let me know when to move the slides for you.
Okay, thank you. It's good to be here. And we just thought I would just go over some of the quantitative measures of for drawing boundaries, and to focus on the Voting Rights Act, Voting Rights Act and compliance with it. So let's move to the next slide. We can see that there's a continuum of population concentrations that we could have. And if we want to get an opportunity district, we need to have over 50% of the minority population in the district. But we have to be careful not to go too high, that the district becomes packed, and then we lose the chance to get more than one district with minority representation. Now, we heard the city attorney discuss these three qualifications, namely, is a district compact, is it politically cohesive, and is there a majority black sufficient to defeat the minority? Now, compactness but you can actually put a number on that. And so there are 4 or 5 different measures of compactness, and one very popular one is just to take the area of your district and divide it by the area of a circle that has the same perimeter. So if you look at these different shapes, a circle would just have a compactness score of 1, a square of about 0.75, but I think we would all agree that a shape like this would not be considered compact. And if you look at the compactness score, you can see that it's quite small, just a few. So that's a good measure of quantifying what we mean by compactness.
Mm-hmm.
So the criteria that the Voting Rights Act will insist on is that you must have a minimum number of minority opportunity districts. The proportion of minority voters would have to be 50% or greater than 50% to target an opportunity district, but less than 75 to 80% to prevent packing. And the compactness test range should be greater than 0.5. Things like the square and the circle and the rectangle look okay. Things that are very distorted just don't work. Ranges are better than hard targets. You can't put a fixed number on any one of these principles. They're guides. Well, given this information, the task force can participate in drawing council districts as an opportunity to test these criteria for soundness and practicality. Mr. Costa said you will have the software and you can try it and see how it works. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Let's see, stop sharing that. And, Mr. Ellison is coming up, and I also have his PowerPoint to share. Nope, I thought I did. Hang on a minute.
While we're waiting, thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for calling out my lessons learned charts on the citizens' participation. I appreciate your giving it your attention.
Okay.
My name is Byerwick Ellison, and I'm with Citizens for Independent Redistricting, and I'm going to confine my comments to minority packing. Next chart, please. In the last redistricting cycle, a lot of high-tech stuff came together. You had inexpensive, powerful computing hardware. You had really sophisticated, robust mapping software that had come way, way down in price, and then big data that joined to make this the process of redistricting a practically engineering precise process. Now, having these high-tech tools in the hands of leaders kind of allowed them to weaponize the redistricting process at the state and federal level. But these same tools in the hands of citizens like us also give us the opportunity to look over their shoulder and see how they operate. And let me give you an example of this. Next chart shows, let's zoom out and look at Tarrant County and Dallas County. This chart shows the distribution of Hispanic voters in these two counties. Each little circle represents a voting precinct. The size of the circle is the population, is proportional to the population of that precinct, and the shading, the darkness of shading represents how dense the district, that precinct is, at least in terms of Hispanic voting here. So you can see in Tarrant County, they're confined, the Hispanic voters are largely north of downtown up to the Loop and the West Seminary area. A much bigger swath of them in Dallas County. Next slide shows your black voters. And again, in Tarrant, they're concentrated southeast of Fort Worth and then largely south of Dallas. The next slide shows you where your white population, white non-Hispanic population is. And make note, actually, of where the white Hispanic population isn't. Next slide shows U.S. Congressional District 33. You can see how that district was drawn by the outline of these dots. So this is an example of how you can pack a district. This district represented by Mark Vesey is 85% minority. It is packed by any definition. Next slide, actually I should mention that this might have been sort of a self-inflicted wound, but the most highly packed districts in Texas, congressionally, are minority districts. They are 80%, 90%, even 92% or 91% or 82% minority. So now let me go to the last chart. All right, let's zoom down into
Actually, your
Fort Worth.
your 3 minutes are up.
Okay, I'm sorry. These are the citizen plans. I just want to call your attention. These were the last district. The last column does not represent one of the criteria that they used, but I included it because the staff called out one of these citizen plans as reducing the number of minority opportunity districts by basically self-packing. So there is a danger that you can self-pack in addition to leaders doing that. So I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our next individual is Janet Brown, and she'll be on the phone.
Hello.
Yes, may I speak to Janet Brown, please?
Yeah, the wrong number.
I'm so sorry. Well, my apologies. Let me look her number up, and we'll go on to the next person.
Hello.
Kenneth Jones?
This is he.
Yes, this is Mary Kaiser. You are on the line with the Redistricting Task Force if you have your comments, and you have 3 minutes.
Yes, I would just like to simply say my brief comments is that I'm lining up with Fernando's group, Lauren, concerning the opportunity for an independent counsel to be involved in this process. And I wanted to know what considerations were given for an outside independent committee to come with this process.
So are you, I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yes, I was asking the question, Fernando's group has made mention of an independent group of individuals, and I know these are individuals that were picked by the city councilmen as their representatives, and I was wondering, was there any consideration for an independent council coming together outside of that for the committee to come together in this process? Was there ever that consideration?
Sir, we're not, we generally don't answer questions. We want to hear your presentation of what your concerns are that you wanted to offer us. So we're not a Q&A session, but we just want to hear from you.
Well, then I can just simply say from what I've listened to tonight, I was very impressed with how Austin came together with their collaborative efforts with the community and the drawing of the lines. Are the lines from the committee of you all, have those lines in the map already been drawn?
No, sir. He's asking
So
questions.
you're
Yeah,
going
I
to
know.
have, that's what I'm asking, Lauren. I'm asking, have that been drawn? And what's the role, since you all have been picked by, I'm just asking, since you all have been picked by city council persons, where does the community's involvement with the different groups come in with you all? And I think what you have on your agenda is that I think it's in January is when we come, or I may be mistaken in that, before you all make the final presentation in March, where community involvement and community input other than just this, do you all come to the particular communities? That's what I'm asking.
Yes, we will come. We will come to the communities, and you'll have an opportunity to come and make a presentation to the task force so that we know what you are concerned about, and we want to hear.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
We appreciate your input.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Joaquin Gonzalez.
Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please consult your directory and call.
Hello?
Is this Joaquin Gonzalez?
Yes, this is he.
This is Mary Kaiser with the City of Fort Worth. You are on the line with the Redistricting Task Force, and you have 3 minutes to make your comments.
Thank you, and thank you for listening to me. My name is Joaquin Gonzalez. I'm a staff attorney with the Voting Rights Program at the Texas Civil Rights Project, and I would like to urge the task force to formalize and really prioritize compliance with the Voting Rights Act. I believe I heard one of the members earlier talk about how this has been done in other redistricting criteria from other jurisdictions, and not only just putting it in as a criteria, but making compliance with the Constitution and the VRA a priority, and some of these other geographic considerations only insofar as they do not weaken compliance with the Constitution or the Voting Rights Act. And as you know, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still in full force, even though Section 5 is not in effect right now. And Section 2 really requires an in-depth look at the practical situation. So I think that should be written into the criteria that that a true look at compliance with Section 2, a full analysis needs to be done. You can't just use these sort of arbitrary baselines like 50%, but it has to do with the totality of the circumstances and sort of the actual statistics on the ground. And also emphasize the process itself to put in place formal procedures for input from the public in both after census data comes out and before maps are proposed, and then as well after different iterations of maps are proposed. And this is also an opportunity to ensure compliance with the Voting Rights Act and avoid litigation by having a formal process for organizations that represent VRA protected groups to have a say in the process. And I think that is it. Thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thank you. We'll go back to Janet Brown now that we have the correct phone number.
This is Janet.
Yes, Ms. Brown, this is Mary Kaiser with the City of Fort Worth, and you're on the line with the Redistricting Task Force, and you have 3 minutes to make your comments.
Okay. Am I after this guy?
No, you're on right now. Your video is 30 seconds delayed.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. My name is Janet Brown. I live in District 9. I am a small business owner and a volunteer deputy voter registrar. I am very concerned about this process. I would like to see independent redistricting committee. I do not want to see you protecting the incumbent council members. They need to represent the people. You need to represent the people as well. Please do not repeat the error from the past, requesting citizen input and then more or less discarding it. I was very interested to hear the information that was presented. I didn't catch his name. I think it was McAvoy. In regard to the potential voters, it looks like less than 60% of potential voters are actually registered in Tarrant County, which is a pretty disgraceful number. Austin has over 90% voter registration rate. And then, well, not Austin, but Travis County. And then rarely do we get 65% of voters to the polls. And I think that this is a function of the gerrymandering and the redistricting. People say all the time, why bother? My vote doesn't count. We need you to reduce the amount of voter suppression and encourage people to vote. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, our next speaker will be Stephanie Swanson. Yes, 281795. Be Stephanie Swanson, and you do have a handout from Ms. Swanson in your materials.
Hello?
Is this Stephanie Swanson?
Yes.
Yes, this is Mary from the City of Fort Worth. You're on the line with the Redistricting Task Force.
Hi.
And you have 3 minutes to make your comments.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you so much. My name is Stephanie Swanson. I'm speaking today as a member of the League of Women Voters of Texas and also on their behalf. I wanted to put forth our position really quick before I forget that. Our position is that we support an independent redistricting wholeheartedly. This is at the national level, state level, and also at many local levels as well. I understand, though, that City Council has given you the task of determining the criteria and the process to use. And so if you would turn to page 3 of the package that I have given you guys, I put forth a list of recommendations specifically for this situation. So I've listed the criteria, suggested timeline, and also ways to improve transparency and the procedures that City Council will use to draw the maps. And so I wanted to point out quickly that for the criteria, I've listed these in ranked order. Number 1 and number 2, population equality and compliance with the Voting Rights Act. Those are, you can't really get around those. Those you have to have those at the top and be in compliance with those because it's federal law. The next is geographic integrity for the criteria, and there are several ones that I've listed out. I should have mentioned at the beginning that this list of recommendations has come from a coalition of voting rights groups at the national level, and it was prepared by voting rights attorneys. It was actually adopted from legislation for an independent redistricting commission as well. So these voting rights groups pulled out, or they put together and drafted what they thought would be appropriate for an independent redistricting commission. And so at any rate, if you go down, I also heard a lot of talk about maps being drawn behind closed doors during the last round of redistricting. We have put in a lot of recommendations for how to prevent that from happening this go round. Besides holding public input hearings in the city, what you would like to see happen is actually maps being drawn in open meetings in front of the public so people can actually see as the lines are being drawn. Let me see what else really quick. Another thing is communications of the council members. It would be nice to know if they do communicate with anyone outside of city council regarding the maps, that becomes public knowledge. And again, all of this is to make sure that this closed door process is brought to light, basically. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but these are the list of recommendations that the League would like to put forth for your consideration. And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Jill Freer. Hello?
Hello, this is Jill Freer.
Yes, Ms. Freer, this is Mary Kaiser. You're on the line with the Redistricting Task Force, and you have 3 minutes to make your comments.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you, Madam Chair and Task Force. I know you have a big job in front of you. I live in Fort Worth on 2916 Merrimack Street. I urge you to recommend to the City Council the creation of an independent redistricting commission to draw the new district map in 2020. Our citizens can only be represented well when the maps are drawn fairly and independently of political bias. Citizens need to know that they matter to the city and that their vote counts and that they have fair representation. It is also important that this task force set fair parameters and guidelines, which I think you're calling criteria, for the Independent Redistricting Commission, and I realize that is your main charter. We know that the current maps don't work. Why do I say that? Because currently about 40% of Fort Worth is Hispanic or Latinx, and there is only one Latinx council member currently. We need a sharp change that removes the city council from the map drawing process. Gerrymandering has no place in the city, especially in our nonpartisan races. When citizens are asked to get involved in redrawing the district boundaries, but the council has a final say, they know that their input doesn't really matter. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg stated in a 2015 Supreme Court case on the constitutionality of independent redistricting commissions, elected officials should remember their dependence on the people, and that the core principle of Republican government is that the voters should choose their representatives, not the other way around. Statistics show that states, cities, and other entities that use independent redistricting commissions have representation that reflects the diversity of their population. There needs to be a realistic time frame for the Independent Redistricting Commission to do the important work of defining the criteria and engaging with the city on drawing new district maps. And I urge you to help the city set realistic schedules for this important work. In summary, I request that you recommend to the City Council that number one, we set up an independent redistricting commission. Number two, ensure that there are fair parameters and guidelines for the commission of this work. And number three, set realistic schedules for completing this important work. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak, and I encourage you to continue on with your important work here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And that's our last speaker.
Well, thank you to all of I think the beauty of this is that we're getting public input on a lot and early, which is, I think, very helpful. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Costa, Ms. Kaiser, could we have a motion to adjourn?
I'd like to move that we adjourn.
Been properly moved in second. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope everybody watches the debate.
Tonight.